Podcast 1 Me. Episode 1. Introducing yourself. Q1. Can you tell me a bit about yourself? Sure. So, my name's Alex, and I guess if I had to sum myself up in a few words, I'd say I'm a fairly curious person. I studied economics, but honestly, the thing that comes across most when people meet me is that I ask a lot of questions about their job, their hometown, whatever. I think it's just how I relate to people, you know? I try to find something in their story that I can connect with. Q2. What do people usually notice about you first? Probably my voice. Actually, a few friends have told me I sound way calmer than I actually feel sometimes. But if we're talking personality, I think people figure out pretty quickly that I'm a listener rather than a talker, at least at first. It takes me a bit of time to open up. Q3. How do you think you've changed over the past few years? A lot, honestly. A few years ago, my whole identity was kind of based on what I did for work. Now I think I'm much more well aware that I'm more than my job title. I've learned to separate who I am from what I produce, which sounds simple, but it took me a while to get there. Q4, is there anything about yourself you'd like to change? Yeah, I'd like to be a bit less hard on myself. My first impression of a situation is often more negative than it needs to be. I tend to expect the worst before I even try something. I'm working on being more fully aware of that pattern so I can catch myself before it spirals. Episode 2. Personality. Q1. How would you describe your personality? I'd say I'm a mix. I'm quite calm on the surface, but underneath I'm actually pretty driven. Friends sometimes say I stand out in group settings not because I'm the loudest, but because I ask the question nobody else thought to ask. Q2. Do you think personality can change over time? Definitely. I used to believe personality was fixed, like you're born a certain way and that's that. But now I think it's closely related to the situations you go through. Stressful jobs, new friendships, moving to a new city, all of that shapes how you respond to the world. Q3. What are the advantages and disadvantages of being an introvert or an extrovert? It really differs significantly depending on the environment. Extroverts tend to thrive in fast-paced, social settings. They can cheer up a room just by walking in. Introverts, on the other hand, often think more deeply before speaking, which is great for problem-solving, but it can also mean they get overlooked in loud group discussions. Neither is better, they just work differently. Q4. Can you give an example of a time your personality helped you in a difficult situation? Yeah, actually, a couple of years ago a close friend was going through a breakup, and everyone else around her was panicking or giving advice she didn't ask for. I just stayed calm and let her talk. I think being naturally patient helped me calm things down without even trying. Q5. How do you think your personality will develop in the future? I imagine I'll become someone who can bring people together more easily. Right now I'm good one-on-one, but I want to grow into someone who's comfortable leading a group. People have a tendency to underestimate how much personality can still shift in your late 20s and 30s. I don't think I'm done changing yet. Episode 3. Daily routine. Q1. What does a typical day look like for you? Honestly, my mornings are pretty structured. I wake up, check my messages, and then I usually set off for a short walk before breakfast. It helps me think. By the time I get to my desk, emails have already started to pile up, so the first hour is mostly just sorting through those. Q2. What part of your routine do you enjoy the least? Definitely the evenings when I stay up too late finishing something that could have waited till morning. I always tell myself I'll wrap up work earlier, but somehow it never quite happens. Q3. What are the benefits of having a fixed routine versus a flexible one? A fixed routine helps you keep up with everything without feeling overwhelmed. You know exactly when to check in on tasks and when to switch off. But a flexible routine gives you room to plan ahead for the unexpected. I think the ideal is somewhere in between, a structure loose enough to bend, but firm enough that things don't fall apart. Q4. Can you describe a day when your routine got completely disrupted? Oh, easily. A few months back my flight got delayed for hours, and my entire schedule just fell apart. I had to cut down on almost everything I'd planned that week just to catch up. It actually taught me not to overpack my calendar. Q5. Do you think your routine will change much in the next few years? I hope so, actually. Right now my mornings remain pretty constant, but I'd like to build in more time for things that don't feel productive, just resting, really. I think that's a healthier way to get back to yourself at the end of a long day. Episode 4, Family. Q1, can you tell me about your family? I was brought up in a fairly small family, just my parents and my younger sister. We were never the loudest household, but we were close. My parents worked a lot, so my sister and I learned to look after each other pretty early on. Q2, how has your relationship with your family changed as you've grown up? It's changed a lot. As a teenager, I didn't always get on with my dad. We argued about small things constantly. But once I moved out, I think we both had to put up with less of each other's daily habits, and somehow that made us appreciate each other more. Q3, what do you think are the benefits of living with extended family versus a nuclear family? There's a real mutual understanding that builds when grandparents, aunts, and cousins are all under one roof. Kids grow up closely associated with more people who look out for them. A nuclear family, though, often has more privacy and independence. Both have their trade-offs. Q4, can you share a memorable family experience? There was a time my parents almost split up when I was around 12. It was a rough year, but eventually they worked things out, and I think it actually made our family stronger. We learned to talk about hard things instead of avoiding them. Q5, how do you imagine your relationship with your family in the future? I hope we stay this close. My parents are getting older now, and I want to be someone who can stand up for them the way they always did for me, making sure they're taken care of, not just checked in on. Episode 5, Friends. Q1, how would you describe your closest friend? My best friend and I met in university, and honestly, she's the person I always catch up with first whenever something big happens in my life. She's steady, the kind of person you can stick with through anything. Q2, what qualities do you look for in a friend? Honesty, mostly. I want someone who'll help me out even when it's inconvenient for them, not just when it's easy. I also admire people I can genuinely look up to, friends who model the kind of person I want to become. Q3, what are the pros and cons of having a large group of friends versus a few close ones? A large circle means more variety, more people to come along to things, more perspectives. But it's easy to fall behind on the people who matter most if your attention is spread too thin. A smaller circle usually means a strong link with each person, but fewer options when someone's unavailable. Q4, can you recall a time a friend helped you through something difficult? Yeah, a few years ago I lost a job I really loved, and one friend basically showed up at my door with food without me even asking. I didn't have to seek help, she just knew. Q5, do you think it's easy to make new friends as an adult? Honestly, no, it gets harder. As kids, we make friends naturally at school, but as adults, you have to be much more intentional about it, or you just drift off from meeting new people altogether. Episode 6, Hobbies. Q1, what hobbies do you have? I took up photography a couple of years ago, almost by accident. I borrowed a friend's camera for a trip and just never gave it back, more or less. Q2, how did you get into this hobby? It started small. I began photographing streets near my house, then slowly started to branch out into portraits. I worked on it every weekend until it stopped feeling like a hobby and started feeling like a habit. Q3, what are the benefits of having a hobby outside of work or study? It gives your brain somewhere else to go. I've come to gain insight into parts of myself through photography that I never noticed at a desk job. Patience, for one. It's highly relevant to how I handle stress now too. When things get overwhelming, I just pick up the camera. Q4, is there a hobby you gave up on? Why? I once signed up for a pottery class, thinking it'd be relaxing. Turns out I have zero patience for clay. Everything I made just collapsed. I never went back after the third class. Q5, is there a new hobby you'd like to try in the future? Yeah, I'd love to try out rock climbing. A few friends swear it's proved useful for their focus and even their confidence at work, so I'm curious to see if it does the same for me. Episode 7, Free Time. Q1, how do you usually spend your free time? Mostly I like to eat out with friends or just sit somewhere quiet and look through old photos. Nothing too dramatic, honestly. I like small, calm evenings. Q2, do you prefer spending free time alone or with others? It really depends on the week. If things have been chaotic, I need a night to just clear up my thoughts alone. But if I've had too much solitude, I crave company again pretty fast. Q3. What are the advantages of having enough free time? You get to use your energy more effectively the rest of the week. When people are constantly busy, they burn out, but rest, when it's real rest, actually helps you work effectively once you're back at it. Q4. Can you describe your ideal weekend? A slow Saturday morning, no plans until noon, and then something spontaneous, a walk, a market, maybe dinner with friends. It has to feel like an individual choice, not something scheduled for me. Q5. Do you think people will have more or less free time in the future? Honestly, I'm not sure. Technology promises more free time, but somehow our calendars just get fuller. I think it comes down to whether people start treating rest as a meaningful part of life, not just the leftover time between tasks. Episode 8. Future Plans. Q1. What are your plans for the next few years? I want to set up something of my own eventually, maybe a small creative business built around photography. Right now, I'm still figuring out the details. Q2. What's one goal you're currently working toward? I recently set a goal to save enough to travel for a few months next year. It's the first big goal I've had in a while that isn't tied to work. Q3. What challenges might you face in achieving your goals? Money's the obvious one, but honestly the bigger challenge is discipline. It's easy to come up with big plans and much harder to actually work them out day by day. Q4. How do you usually plan for the future? Do you plan in detail or go with the flow? I used to plan everything in detail, but I've realized that trying to make a prediction about every outcome just adds stress. Now I set a direction and stay flexible about the exact path. Q5. Where do you see yourself in 10 years? I hope I'll have achieved at least one big goal I'm proud of, whatever shape that takes. Honestly, this feels like an increasingly important question the older I get, not because I need all the answers now, but because thinking about it keeps me moving towards something, rather than just drifting. That's my ultimate goal, really, to look back and feel like I built something on purpose. Podcast 2, Education and Career. Episode 1, School. Q1, what was school like for you growing up? Pretty ordinary, honestly. I wasn't the kid who stood out academically, but I showed up, did the work, and got along with most teachers. Looking back, I think what I remember most isn't the grades, it's the small routines, like walking to school with the same 3 friends every single day. Q2, was there a subject you struggled with? Math, without a doubt. My teachers had pretty high standards, and I just couldn't seem to meet those expectations no matter how much I studied. I remember spending hours just trying to follow instructions in the textbook and still getting the wrong answer. Q3. What are the advantages and disadvantages of the exam-based education system? It does push students to focus and measure academic performance in a consistent way, which schools need for fairness. But the downside is real. Some students who are brilliant in other ways just don't perform well under exam pressure, and the system doesn't always capture that. Q4. Can you describe a memorable teacher or experience from school? There was one teacher in my final year who noticed I was quiet in class, but wrote really well. She encouraged me to enter a writing competition. That was such an early-stage moment for me, honestly, because it's the first time I thought I might actually be good at something academic. Q5. How do you think schools will change in the future? I think schools will move away from pure memorization and toward skills that matter in real life, critical thinking, communication, things like that. Whether the exam system will actually change is another question, but I hope it does. Episode 2, University. Q1. What did you study at university and why? I studied economics, mostly because I liked the idea of understanding how systems work, how a small change in one place can ripple through an entire market. I wanted to acquire knowledge that felt genuinely useful, not just theoretical. Q2. What was the biggest challenge during your university years? Definitely the workload in my second year. We had to complete so many tasks at once, readings, group assignments, a thesis proposal, that I nearly dropped out of one elective just to keep my head above water. Q3. What are the pros and cons of studying abroad versus staying in your home country? Studying abroad gives you a wide range of perspectives you just can't get otherwise. Different teaching styles, different classmates, a totally different rhythm of life. But it's expensive, and it can be isolating if you don't build a support network quickly. Staying home is more affordable and familiar, though you might miss out on that broader exposure. Q4. Can you share an experience from a group project or assignment? Oh, I remember one group project where none of us agreed on the direction until the night before it was due. We basically rewrote the entire first draft in about 6 hours. Somehow it worked out, and, honestly, that chaos taught me more about teamwork than any smooth project ever did. Q5. Do you think a university degree is still as valuable as it used to be? I think it depends on the field. A degree still helps you gain insight into how to think critically and contribute significantly to a workplace, but it's no longer the only path. A lot of people now build a deep understanding of their field through other routes: boot camps, self-study, direct experience. Episode 3. Learning English. Q1. How did you start learning English? Mostly through school, but honestly, it didn't really click until I started watching shows and podcasts without subtitles. That's when I actually had to figure out meaning from context instead of translating word by word. Q2. What part of learning English do you find most difficult? Phrasal verbs, ironically. There's always some little detail I have to brush up on, like the difference between look up and look up to. They look so similar but mean completely different things. Q3. What are the benefits of learning a language through real content versus textbooks? Real content forces you to keep up with natural speed and natural pronunciation, which textbooks rarely capture. It's slower at first, but it helps you communicate effectively in situations a textbook dialogue would never prepare you for. Q4. Can you describe a moment you felt proud of your English progress? There was a moment I finally understood a joke in English without translating it in my head first. That split-second reaction felt huge. It made me realize how much I'd managed to catch up on over the years without even noticing. Q5. What are your goals for improving your English in the future? I want to work on verbal communication, specifically speaking fluently under pressure, like in interviews or presentations. It's becoming increasingly common for jobs to require confident spoken English, so I know it'll prove useful eventually. Episode 4. Study Habits. Q1. What does your typical study session look like? I usually start by making a quick list, nothing fancy, just a few things jotted down on paper. Then I work in blocks, maybe 45 minutes at a time, before taking a short break. Q2. What's a bad study habit you're trying to break? Definitely leaving things until the last possible moment. I'll tell myself I'm going to plan ahead, and then somehow I still let tasks pile up. Wait, that's more of a work habit actually, but it shows up in studying too. I'm trying to cut down on that. Q3. What are the advantages of studying with a plan versus studying spontaneously? A plan keeps you from falling behind, especially when there's a lot of material to cover. Spontaneous studying can work if you're naturally disciplined, but most people, myself included, need at least a loose structure or things quietly slip through the cracks. Q4. Can you recall a time good preparation really paid off? Before one big exam, I spent a week just going back through my notes, looking through everything I'd missed the first time. It felt tedious at the time, but I walked into that exam calmer than I'd ever felt before. The preparation genuinely paid off. Q5. How do you think your study habits will evolve as you keep learning? I think I'll get better at knowing when to stop. Right now I sometimes overstudy out of anxiety. Eventually, I'd like to be able to sum up what I need to know efficiently and trust that I've done enough. Episode 5. Research. Q1. Have you ever had to conduct research for school or work? Yes, quite a bit actually. In university, I had to conduct research for my final thesis, and it was honestly more involved than I expected, way more time spent reading than writing. Q2. What part of the research process do you find most challenging? Definitely narrowing things down. There's so much existing research out there on almost any topic that the hardest part is figuring out what's actually relevant to your specific question. Q3. What are the benefits of using multiple sources versus relying on just one? Using multiple sources protects you from bias. One source might present scientific evidence in a slightly skewed way, intentionally or not. Cross-checking against other studies helps you trust that the information is genuinely reliable. Q4. Can you describe a time you found surprising results in your research? I was researching consumer behavior once, expecting one clear pattern, but the data I managed to obtain told a completely different story. It forced me to rewrite half my argument, which was frustrating, but honestly made the final paper much stronger. Q5. How do you think research methods will change with new technology? I think AI tools will make it much easier to gather information and collect data at scale, but I also think it'll get harder to draw a conclusion you can fully trust without double-checking the sources yourself. The key findings will still need a human eye. Episode 6. Jobs. Q1. What was your first job like? My first job was at a small cafe near campus. It wasn't glamorous, but it taught me a lot, mostly how to stay calm when everything goes wrong at once during a lunch rush. Q2. What do you look for in a job? Honestly, I look for a role where I'll actually take on responsibility, not just repeat the same task all day. I also care about whether the people around me genuinely want to work out problems together instead of just assigning blame. Q3. What are the advantages and disadvantages of working for a big company versus a small one? A big company usually offers stability and a major advantage in terms of resources and structured career paths. A small company, on the other hand, often gives you more responsibility earlier, and the major difference you notice immediately is how much closer you are to the actual decisions being made. Q4. Can you describe a challenge you faced early in your career? In my first real job, I struggled to meet a client's requirement that kept shifting halfway through a project. I had to seek help from a more experienced colleague, which felt embarrassing at the time, but taught me that asking for support early saves everyone time later. Q5. What kind of job do you see yourself doing in the future? I'd like something that lets me face a challenge regularly without burning out, maybe something creative, tied to storytelling or strategy. I haven't found the perfect alternative solution to my current role yet, but I'm exploring. Episode 7. Workplace. Q1. How would you describe the atmosphere at your workplace? It's fairly relaxed, but people still take deadlines seriously. Everyone's expected to deal with their own tasks, but there's a strong culture of helping out when someone's overwhelmed. Q2. What's something that helps you stay productive at work? Honestly, having a manager who's willing to point out issues early rather than letting them build up makes a huge difference. Small, honest feedback keeps everyone from working on the wrong thing for too long. Q3. What are the pros and cons of working in an office versus working remotely? An office environment usually supports effective communication naturally. You overhear things, you bump into people, ideas move faster. But it can also be distracting. Working from home gives you focus, but it takes more effort to build interpersonal skills and stay connected with the team. Q4. Can you share a time teamwork made a real difference at work? There was a project that was falling apart until 3 of us decided to communicate effectively instead of working in silos. We basically rebuilt the whole plan in one afternoon. And the result had a genuinely positive impact on the client relationship. Q5. How do you think workplaces will change in the coming years? I think there'll be more focus on high-quality output over long hours, measuring what actually gets done rather than how many hours someone sits at a desk. That shift feels overdue, honestly. Episode 8. Professional Development. Q1. What have you done recently to develop your skills? I've been taking an online course in project management, mostly to take initiative in areas I used to avoid. It's part of a broader push toward professional development I set for myself this year. Q2. What's a skill you'd like to improve? Public speaking, definitely. It's a technical skill in some ways, pacing, structure, but it's mostly about confidence, which takes practice more than theory. Q3. What are the benefits of continuous learning throughout your career? It keeps you relevant. Industries change fast, and if you're not actively working to enhance your performance, you risk falling behind people who are. It also just keeps work interesting. There's always something new to learn. Q4. Can you describe feedback that really helped you grow professionally? A mentor once sat down and helped me make an assessment of my own blind spots, things I genuinely couldn't see myself. I didn't love hearing it at the time, but I've never forgotten how useful that conversation was. Being able to both provide feedback and actually receive feedback well turned out to matter more than any single skill. Q5. Where do you want your career to be in 5 years? I want to have grown into a role where I'm setting the professional standard for the people around me, not just meeting it myself. My key objective for the next 5 years is simple: build something I'm proud to explain when someone asks what I do. Podcast 3, Modern Life. Episode 1, Technology. Q1, how much has technology changed the way you live day to day? Honestly, it's changed almost everything. I used to write things down on paper, now I just log into an app, and it's all synced across my devices. Even small routines like paying bills used to take a whole afternoon and now take about 2 minutes. Q2, is there a piece of technology you can't live without? My phone, without question. I plug it in every night like clockwork, and if I forget, the next morning genuinely feels stressful, like I'm missing a part of myself. Q3, what are the advantages and disadvantages of relying heavily on technology? The advantage is obvious. Things are faster, more convenient, and technological advances have made information available in seconds. But the downside is that when systems break down, even briefly, we're often not prepared to function without them. We've kind of lost the habit of doing things the slow way. Q4, can you describe a time technology let you down? Once, right before an important presentation, my laptop just decided to shut down and wouldn't turn back on. I hadn't backed up my slides in weeks, and I had to rebuild half the presentation from memory in 20 minutes. Q5, how do you think technology will change our lives in the next decade? I think AI will greatly enhance how we handle repetitive tasks, which honestly could be a relief. The challenge will be keeping up with how fast it moves. By the time you learn one tool, 3 new ones have already replaced it. Episode 2, Internet. Q1, how do you usually use the internet in a typical day? Mostly for work, emails, research, quick searches whenever I need to find out something fast. But honestly, a good chunk of it is also just scrolling mindlessly in the evening. Q2, what's something you always look up online? Recipes, weirdly. I'll look up the same dish 5 different times because I never remember the exact steps. Q3, what are the benefits and risks of having so much information freely available? It's incredible that knowledge is so freely available now. Anyone with a connection has online access to things that used to require a library card and hours of searching. But the risk is that not everything readily available online is actually true, and it takes a trained eye to tell the difference. Q4, can you recall a time the internet helped you solve a real problem? Once my washing machine broke, and instead of paying for a technician, I came across a video that showed the exact same issue. Fixed it myself in 20 minutes, which felt oddly satisfying. Q5, do you think internet access will keep expanding to more people in the future? I hope so. Internet access is still uneven around the world, but information sharing at this scale has real potential to close gaps in education and opportunity if it's managed well. Episode 3, Shopping. Q1, do you prefer shopping online or in physical stores? Honestly, a mix. I like to shop around online first to compare prices, but for clothes specifically, I still prefer to try things on in a real store. Q2, what's your approach when you're looking for something specific to buy? I usually stock up on things I know I'll need regularly, so I'm not scrambling later when something runs out. For bigger purchases, I take my time and read a lot of reviews before deciding. Q3, what are the pros and cons of online shopping compared to in-store shopping? Online shopping gives you access to a wide range of products you'd never find locally, and it's convenient. You can browse late at night in your pajamas. But in-store shopping lets you actually see and feel the product, and you avoid the frustration of something selling outright as you finally decide to buy it. Q4, can you describe a shopping experience that didn't go as planned? I once ordered a jacket online that looked completely different from the photos, wrong color, wrong fit. I had to cut down on impulse purchases after that. I'm much more careful about reading the fine print now. Q5, how do you think shopping habits will change in the future? With increased demand for convenience, I think more stores will blend online and offline experiences, like ordering online and just picking up the item nearby within the hour. Episode 4, Transportation. Q1, how do you usually get around in your daily life? Mostly public transport, the bus, mainly, sometimes the metro if I'm heading further out. It's not always fast, but it's reliable enough that I don't stress about it. Q2. What's the most stressful part of commuting for you? Definitely when I run into unexpected delays, a bus that just doesn't show up, or traffic that comes out of nowhere. I always try to set off early just to have a buffer. Q3. What are the advantages of public transport over private vehicles? Public transport is usually more sustainable and takes pressure off congested roads, especially in dense urban areas. It's also just less stressful. You're not the one who has to focus on the road the whole time. Q4. Can you describe a memorable transportation mishap? Once I fell asleep on a long bus ride and missed my stop by nearly an hour. I ended up in an area of the city I didn't even know existed. Turned out to be kind of a fun accident, honestly. Q5. How do you think transportation will change in the future? I expect a significant increase in electric and shared transport options, especially as cities try to reduce emissions. Even rural areas might eventually benefit from better connectivity if the infrastructure catches up. Episode 5. Food. Q1. What role does food play in your daily routine? It's more central than I used to admit. I used to just fill up on whatever was fastest, but now I actually plan meals a bit, mostly because I feel so much better when I do. Q2. Do you enjoy cooking or do you prefer eating out? Both, depending on my mood. Some evenings I love taking the time to chop up vegetables and cook slowly. Other nights I just want to eat out and let someone else handle it. Q3. What are the benefits of home-cooked meals versus fast food? Home-cooked meals let you control exactly what goes in, which matters more the older I get. Fast food is convenient when you're exhausted, but it's easy to overdo it. You barely notice how much you've eaten before you've eaten up the whole portion. Q4. Can you describe a memorable meal or food experience? I once tried to cook a dish way above my skill level for a dinner party. Took me nearly 4 hours to heat up and prepare everything properly, and I nearly used up every pan in my kitchen. It turned out well in the end, somehow. Q5. How do you think eating habits will change in the future? There's a growing current trend toward plant-based eating, at least in cities. I think that'll keep expanding as more people become aware of both health and environmental reasons behind it. Episode 6. Health. Q1. How do you try to stay healthy in daily life? Mostly small habits, walking instead of taking a ride for short distances, drinking enough water, that kind of thing. Nothing dramatic, just consistency. Q2. What's a health habit you've struggled to maintain? Sleep, honestly. I know I should deal with my late nights, but old habits are hard to break, especially when work piles up. Wait, that's the wrong context, but you get the idea. Q3. What are the benefits of preventive healthcare versus treating problems as they arise? Preventive healthcare helps you avoid a potential risk before it becomes something serious, and it's usually far less costly, both financially and physically, than waiting until there's an adverse effect you can no longer ignore. Q4. Can you describe a time you had to recover from an illness or injury? I sprained my ankle pretty badly a couple of years ago, and it took weeks to fully get over it. I remember trying to stay calm and just trusting the process instead of rushing back into activity too early. Q5. How do you think attitudes toward health will change in the future? I think people will get better at managing their stress level proactively, instead of letting things boil over before addressing them. Mental health, in particular, is finally being treated with the seriousness it deserves. Episode 7. Travel. Q1. How often do you get to travel, and where do you usually go? Not as often as I'd like, honestly, maybe once or twice a year. I tend to gravitate toward places with a mix of nature and culture rather than pure city breaks. Q2. What's something that always goes wrong when you travel? Something always turns up unexpected, a delayed flight, a hotel booking gone wrong. I've learned to just build in extra time and expect a little chaos. Q3. What are the advantages of traveling alone versus traveling with others? Traveling alone gives you total flexibility. You can check in whenever you want, change plans on a whim. Traveling with others means someone else might come along for the ride even when your energy's low, and honestly, shared memories tend to stick with you longer. Q4. Can you share a memorable travel experience? I once ran into an old classmate completely by accident in a train station on the other side of the world. We ended up spending the whole afternoon together, one of those small moments that felt bigger than it should have. Q5. Where would you like to travel to in the future? Somewhere that would give me access to a completely different culture, maybe somewhere in South America. There's a growing trend of remote work travel too, and I'd love to try it, even briefly, within a broader global context of just seeing how people live differently. Episode 8. Communication. Q1. How do you usually stay in touch with people? Mostly messaging apps now, though I still call back when something feels too complicated to type out. There's something about hearing someone's actual voice that a text just can't replace. Q2. Has the way you communicate changed much over the years? Definitely. I used to hang up the phone the second a call felt awkward. Now I'm more comfortable sitting in silence for a moment instead of rushing to fill it. Q3. What are the pros and cons of texting versus calling someone? Texting is quick and doesn't cut off your day the way a long call might, but it's easy to misread tone. Calling forces you to speak up clearly and actually listen, which builds a different kind of connection. Q4. Can you describe a miscommunication that caused a problem? Once a friend and I completely misunderstood each other over text. What I meant as a joke landed completely wrong. We had to sit down and actually touch on what went wrong instead of letting it fester. Q5. How do you think communication will change in the future? I think we'll continue to draw on more visual and voice-based tools instead of plain text, since so much meaning gets lost in typed words. It's hard to fully account for tone and emotion through a screen, and I think future tools will try to fix exactly that. Podcast 4. The World. Episode 1. Environment. Q1. How concerned are you about environmental issues in general? Quite concerned, honestly, though it took me a while to get there. For a long time I thought of environmental damage as something abstract, happening somewhere far away. It wasn't until I started paying attention to local news that it felt real. Q2. What's one environmental habit you've changed in your own life? I've gotten much more careful about waste, small things, like carrying my own bag instead of picking up a new one every time. It's not dramatic, but it's a habit built on growing awareness rather than guilt. Q3. What are the advantages and disadvantages of strict environmental regulations? Strict regulations force industries to reduce their environmental impact, which is necessary given how much human activity has already reshaped ecosystems. The downside is that regulations can slow economic growth in the short term, and smaller businesses sometimes struggle to keep up with the cost of compliance. Q4. Can you describe a moment that made you more aware of environmental damage? I visited a coastal town a few years ago where the beach was covered in plastic that had washed in from somewhere else entirely. It had such a negative effect on the whole landscape that I couldn't stop thinking about it for weeks afterward. Q5. How do you think environmental protection will evolve in the future? I think we'll see governments finally take initiative on a larger scale, not just relying on individuals to change habits. There's also a real need to raise awareness among younger generations before the damage becomes irreversible. Episode 2. Climate Change. Q1. How visible is climate change in the place where you live? More visible than it used to be. Summers feel noticeably hotter than they did when I was a kid, and storms seem to arrive with less warning than before. Q2. What do you think is the biggest misconception about climate change? That it's a distant problem for future generations. People often underestimate how rapidly changing conditions already are. It's not some far-off scenario anymore. It's happening in real time. Q3. What are the pros and cons of individual action versus government policy in tackling climate change? Individual action matters, small choices add up, and they shift culture over time. But without climate change being addressed through actual policy, individual effort alone can't match the scale of the problem. Emissions increase dramatically when large industries aren't held accountable, and no amount of individual recycling offsets that. Q4. Can you describe a natural disaster or extreme weather event that affected you or someone you know? A friend's hometown was hit by a severe flood a couple of years ago, a genuine natural disaster that displaced hundreds of families. It really brought home how the serious consequences of climate change aren't hypothetical anymore. Q5. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about how climate change will be handled in the future? Cautiously optimistic, I'd say. There's still a real potential risk that action comes too late, but I've also seen genuine momentum, more investment, more public pressure. That gives me some hope. Episode 3. Science. Q1. What role does science play in your everyday life? More than I usually notice, from the medicine in my cabinet to the phone in my pocket, almost everything around me exists because someone once decided to conduct research into a question nobody had answered yet. Q2. Is there a scientific topic you find particularly fascinating? Space, definitely. I love reading about how the scientific community keeps revising its own theories as new evidence comes in. It's humbling, honestly, how much we still don't know. Q3. What are the benefits of scientific research being open and shared globally? Open research lets scientists across the world build on each other's work instead of duplicating it. When findings are shared, it becomes much easier to test a theory rigorously. More eyes checking the same scientific evidence means fewer mistakes slip through. Q4. Can you describe a scientific discovery that surprised you? I remember reading about how certain technological advances in medicine came from research that was originally meant for something completely unrelated. It's strange how much progress comes from unexpected directions. Q5. How do you think science will change our lives in the future? I think we'll see science increasingly promote the development of solutions to problems we've struggled with for decades: disease, food security, energy. Scientists will keep needing to undertake research in areas that don't yet have obvious answers, and that unpredictability is part of what makes it exciting. Episode 4. Government. Q1. How closely do you follow government policy and news? Fairly closely, though it depends on the topic. I try to stay informed about anything that could genuinely shape daily life: housing, healthcare, that sort of thing. Q2. What's an area where you think government involvement is necessary? Public transport, honestly. Without proper government policy guiding infrastructure, cities end up with systems that are inconsistent or underfunded, and that affects everyone, not just people who can't afford a car. Q3. What are the advantages and disadvantages of government control over public services? Government control can ensure services stay accessible to everyone, not just those who can pay a premium. But too much control, without accountability, can lead to inefficiency. A mix involving the private sector, with a solid regulatory framework in place, often works better than either extreme alone. Q4. Can you describe a government policy that directly affected your life? A change in tax policy a few years back genuinely affected my household budget. Nothing dramatic, but enough that I noticed it every month. It made me pay much closer attention to policy discussions after that. Q5. How do you think the role of government will change in the future? I think there'll be more pressure to address issues like inequality directly, alongside a growing demand for equal opportunity, regardless of background. Whether governments manage to keep up with that pressure is a different question entirely. Episode 5. Society. Q1. What social issue do you care most about? Access to education, probably. I think it shapes almost everything else: health, opportunity, even how connected people feel to the world around them. Q2. How has society changed in your lifetime that surprises you most? Honestly, how quickly opinions can shift. Things that felt fixed when I was younger have changed faster than I expected, partly because information now spreads so fast. Q3. What are the benefits of a diverse society? A diverse society brings a diverse range of ideas and perspectives, which tends to lead to better problem-solving overall. It also fosters a mutual understanding between groups that might otherwise never interact. Q4. Can you describe an experience that changed your perspective on a social issue? I once volunteered with a group supporting a vulnerable group in my city, people dealing with housing insecurity. Seeing their actual living conditions up close changed how I thought about the issue far more than any article ever had. Q5. How do you think society will look in 50 years? I think there will be greater awareness of issues that today still feel niche: mental health, long-term sustainability, things like that. The younger generation already seems to care more openly about these topics than previous ones did. Episode 6. Culture. Q1. How connected do you feel to your own cultural background? Fairly connected, though it comes and goes. Certain traditions, especially around food and family gatherings, still feel deeply tied to my cultural background, even when daily life feels quite modern otherwise. Q2. What's something from another culture you've come to appreciate? I've come to really appreciate how some cultures treat mealtimes as something unhurried, almost sacred. It's closely associated with a slower pace of life that I honestly wish I practiced more myself. Q3. What are the benefits and risks of cultures blending together more than before? Blending cultures often leads to genuinely exciting creativity, food, music, art that wouldn't exist otherwise. It's now widely accepted that this exchange enriches everyone involved. The risk, though, is that smaller or more fragile traditions can get diluted or forgotten if they're not deliberately preserved. Q4. Can you describe a moment you felt a strong sense of cultural identity? At a family celebration a couple of years ago, a certain dish was prepared exactly the way it's generally known as traditional in my family. Nothing had changed in generations. That kind of continuity gave me a real sense of belonging in a way I hadn't expected. Q5. How do you think culture will evolve in an increasingly connected world? I think we'll need a deep understanding of other traditions to avoid flattening everything into one homogeneous global culture. Within a broader global context, preserving distinct identity is going to matter more, not less, even as connection increases. Episode 7. Globalization. Q1. How has globalization affected your daily life? Enormously, actually. Even in small ways, the food I eat, the clothes I wear, most of it comes from global trade networks I never really think about until I stop to consider it. Q2. What's a product or trend you've seen spread globally? Coffee culture, weirdly specific as that sounds. What used to feel like a regional habit is now practically universal, part of a wider global trend that's fascinating how consistent it's become across so many different countries. Q3. What are the advantages and disadvantages of global trade? Global trade drives economic growth and gives consumers access to imported products they'd otherwise never see. But it also creates increased competition that can hurt local producers who can't match the scale of larger international suppliers. Q4. Can you describe how globalization has affected job opportunities where you live? Industrial development tied to international investment has created new jobs in my area, but it's also shifted the kind of work available, more service-based roles, fewer traditional manufacturing ones. Q5. Do you think globalization will continue at the same pace in the future? I think it's highly likely to continue, though maybe not always in the same direction. There's an ever-increasing pull toward interconnected economies, even as the vast majority of countries occasionally push back with more protective policies. Episode 8. Future. Q1. What excites you most about the future? Honestly, the pace of future development in areas like medicine and clean energy. It feels like problems that seemed permanent might actually be solvable within our lifetime. Q2. What worries you most about the future? Inequality, mostly, that the benefits of progress won't be shared evenly, and some groups will be left further behind while others race ahead. Q3. What are the benefits and risks of rapid technological and social change? Rapid change brings genuine opportunity, new tools, new ways of solving old problems. But it also brings significant change that societies aren't always prepared to absorb quickly, and that gap between innovation and adaptation is where a lot of the real risk lies. Q4. Can you describe a prediction you made that turned out to be completely wrong? Years ago, I was convinced a certain technology trend would fade within a year. It's now completely mainstream. It taught me to hold predictions a little more loosely, honestly. It's highly unlikely that anyone gets these things fully right. Q5. If you could influence one thing about the future, what would it be? I'd want people to have greater flexibility in how they build their lives, work, family, purpose, without feeling boxed into one path too early. That's my ultimate goal, in a way, not just for myself, but for whoever comes after us, a world with a bit more room to breathe. Podcast 5. Business, Strategy, and Professional Life. Episode 1. Taking Responsibility and Setting Priorities. Q1. How do you decide what to prioritize when you have too much on your plate? Honestly, it took me years to get better at this. Early in my career, I treated every task as equally urgent, which just wasn't sustainable. Now I try to ask one simple question first: what actually matters most right now? Usually that becomes my first priority, and everything else gets slotted in around it. I've also learned to give priority to tasks that unblock other people, not just the ones that feel most pressing to me personally, because if I'm the bottleneck, the whole team slows down. It's not a perfect system, but it saved me from a lot of unnecessary stress. Q2. Do you think people should always accept responsibility for their mistakes at work, even small ones? I genuinely think so, yes. It's tempting to explain away a small error, but I've noticed that people who accept responsibility quickly, without excuses, tend to earn far more trust over time. There's a difference between panicking and simply saying, "That was on me. Here's how I'll fix it." I try to assume responsibility early rather than waiting for someone else to point it out, because by the time that happens, the damage is usually bigger than it needed to be. Q3. What's the difference between having a high priority and a minimum requirement for a project? A minimum requirement is the baseline, the thing that absolutely has to be true for a project to even count as finished. A high priority, on the other hand, is more about urgency and importance relative to everything else on your list. Something can be a high priority without being a strict requirement. I think a lot of workplace conflict actually comes from people mixing these two up, treating a nice-to-have as if it were mandatory, or ignoring a genuine minimum standard because something else feels more exciting. Q4. Can you describe a moment when you had to become aware of a problem you'd been ignoring? There was a stretch, maybe 2 years ago, where I kept dismissing small complaints about a process at work as one-off issues. It wasn't until 3 separate people mentioned the same friction point that I finally had to become aware that it was systemic, not incidental. That moment was humbling, realizing I'd been so focused on my own tasks that I missed something obvious to everyone else. Q5. What role does a manager play in helping a team stay focused on what matters? A good manager plays a genuinely crucial role here, not by micromanaging, but by protecting the team's attention from constant distractions. I've worked under managers who took on a major role in shielding us from unnecessary meetings and shifting priorities, and the difference in output was massive. When leadership doesn't do this, everyone ends up guessing what actually matters, and the final product suffers because energy gets spread too thin across too many things. Episode 2. Strategy and Planning. Q1. How important is it to develop a clear strategy before starting a big project? Extremely important, in my experience, though I used to underestimate this. I once jumped straight into execution without taking the time to develop a strategy, and we ended up redoing half the work a month in. Now I insist on spending real time at the planning stage, even when it feels slow, because that upfront thinking saves far more time later than it costs at the start. Q2. Do you personally have a strategy for managing your career, or do you take things as they come? A bit of both, honestly. I do have a strategy in the sense that I know roughly what kind of work I want to be doing in a few years, but I try not to plan every single step because opportunities rarely show up exactly the way you expect. What I've committed to more seriously lately is genuine strategic planning around skills, deliberately choosing what to learn next instead of drifting. Q3. What are the advantages of using a modern method over a traditional method at work? A modern method often takes advantage of tools and data that simply didn't exist when a traditional method was designed, so it can be faster or more accurate. But traditional approaches usually carry hard-won wisdom. They've been tested over time, and that matters too. I generally favor an effective method over a fashionable one. Whether it's old or new, what matters most to me is whether it actually gets the job done reliably. Q4. How do you decide which method or approach to apply to a new type of problem? I usually start by looking at how similar problems were solved before, then decide whether to apply a method that already exists or build something new. If there's already a standard method the industry trusts, I'll default to that unless there's a clear reason not to. Reinventing the wheel rarely pays off unless the old wheel is genuinely broken. Q5. Can you think of a time your original plan didn't work and you had to consider an alternative method? Definitely. A project I worked on hit a wall about halfway through. The approach we'd chosen just wasn't scaling. We had to pause and seriously consider an alternative method, which felt frustrating at the time because it meant admitting the first plan wasn't working. But switching turned out to be the right call, and it taught me not to be too attached to a single strategy just because we'd already invested time in it. Episode 3: Resources and Efficiency. Q1. How do you decide how to allocate resources when there isn't enough to go around? This is one of the hardest parts of any project, honestly. When you have to allocate resources across competing needs, someone inevitably feels shortchanged. I try to be transparent about the reasoning, explaining why one area gets more budget or people than another, because even when people disagree with the decision, they usually respect it more when they understand the logic behind it. Q2. What do you do when you have limited resources but ambitious goals? You get creative mostly. Working with limited resources forces you to cut anything that isn't essential and focus only on what genuinely moves the needle. I've actually found that having fewer available resources sometimes produces better thinking than having plenty. Abundance can make people lazy about prioritization. Q3. Do you think natural resources should be managed differently by governments versus private companies? I think natural resources need a mix of both, honestly. Companies are good at using resources efficiently when there's a clear incentive to do so, but without oversight, that efficiency can come at a real cost to the environment or to future generations. Governments need to make available the right regulations and protections so that short-term efficiency doesn't quietly become long-term damage. Q4. What are the benefits of using a widely used tool or platform instead of something niche? A widely used tool usually has more support, more documentation, and a bigger community to ask for help. It's also frequently used enough that new hires often already know how it works, which saves training time. The downside is that popular tools aren't always the best technical fit. Sometimes a smaller, more specialized option would actually serve you better, even if it's less common. Q5. How do you make sure information or a service stays easily accessible to the people who need it? I've learned that something being technically available isn't the same as it being genuinely easily accessible. A document buried in 10 folders might exist, but practically speaking, no one can find it. I try to keep processes relatively straightforward, clear naming, clear locations, because complexity quietly discourages people from using the resources you've worked hard to provide. Episode 4: Challenges and Problem Solving. Q1. What's the biggest professional challenge you've faced recently? Honestly, a major challenge came up last year when a key client changed their requirements halfway through a long project. It wasn't quite a serious challenge in the sense of threatening the business, but it forced a lot of rework under time pressure, and managing everyone's frustration, including my own, was harder than the technical problem itself. Q2. How do you usually respond when you encounter problems you didn't anticipate? I try to pause before reacting. When you encounter problems you didn't see coming, the instinct is to panic or assign blame, but neither actually solves anything. I've found it's more useful to just name the problem clearly first, then figure out who's best placed to help. Sometimes that's me, sometimes it isn't. Q3. Have you ever had to work through a genuinely complex process that felt overwhelming at first? Yes, definitely. There was a complex process involving several departments that none of us fully understood end to end. Everyone only knew their own piece. As the project grew, the increasing complexity became genuinely stressful, and it took deliberately mapping the whole thing out on a whiteboard before it stopped feeling chaotic. Q4. What do you do when a task turns out to be highly complex or when you experience real difficulties completing it? When something is highly complex, I try to break it into smaller pieces rather than attacking it all at once. That alone removes a lot of the anxiety. If I experience difficulties I can't solve alone, I ask for help earlier than my instincts want me to. Waiting too long just compounds the problem. Q5. Can working under pressure ever have a direct impact on the quality of decisions people make? Absolutely, and not always for the better. Pressure can have a direct impact on judgment. People start cutting corners or reacting emotionally rather than thinking clearly. That said, I've also seen pressure make an impact in a positive way, pushing a team to finally resolve something they'd been avoiding for weeks. It really depends on whether the pressure feels manageable or overwhelming. Episode 5: Information and Communication. Q1: What makes someone good at conveying complicated information clearly? I think the best communicators know how to convey information without drowning people in unnecessary detail. They know what actually needs saying and what can wait. I've worked with people who could extract information from a messy, complicated situation and hand you back 3 clear sentences. That's a genuinely rare and valuable skill. Q2: How do you make sure a presentation gives people enough factual information without becoming boring? I try to lead with factual information they actually need to make a decision, and save the extra detail for questions afterward rather than cramming it all into the main talk. When I give an overview of something complicated, I usually sketch the big picture first, then go deeper only where people show interest. Q3: What do you do with given information that turns out to be incomplete or possibly wrong? This happens more often than people admit. If given information looks incomplete, I flag it immediately rather than quietly working around the gap, because guessing usually causes bigger problems later. Once you start to process information you don't fully trust, it's easy to build an entire plan on a shaky foundation. Q4: How important is it to know your target audience before you provide information to them? Hugely important. What you provide information about, and how you phrase it, should shift completely depending on your target audience. A technical team needs different detail than a client does. I've made the mistake of using the same explanation for both groups before, and it landed badly with each of them for opposite reasons. Q5: Is it useful to look at a recent study before making a business decision, or is intuition enough? I think both matter, honestly. A recent study can validate or challenge assumptions you didn't realize you were making, which is genuinely useful. But data from a study rarely captures every detail of your specific situation, so I try to provide an alternative perspective alongside the numbers, asking what the data might be missing, not just what it says. Episode 6: Innovation, Technology, and Change. Q1: How has modern technology changed the way your team collaborates? Enormously. Modern technology means we can work across time zones without losing much momentum, something that would have been nearly impossible a decade ago. That said, it also means expectations have shifted. People now assume you'll respond quickly just because the tools make it technically possible. Q2: Do you think structural change within a company is usually good or disruptive? It depends entirely on how it's handled. Structural change can genuinely improve how decisions get made and who's accountable for what, but if it's rushed, it mostly just creates confusion and anxiety. I've seen reorganizations succeed only when leadership took the time to explain the reasoning clearly instead of just announcing a new chart. Q3: Can you describe a time someone brought a genuinely new perspective to a problem your team was stuck on? Yes. A newer colleague once questioned an assumption the rest of us had stopped even noticing we were making. That fresh new perspective completely reframed the problem, and honestly, it was a little embarrassing that it took someone unfamiliar with our habits to see it. It reminded me how valuable it is to keep bringing in people who haven't been shaped by the same routines. Q4: What role does intellectual property play in how companies think about innovation? Intellectual property shapes a lot of strategic decisions. Actually, companies sometimes hold back from sharing ideas openly simply to protect what they've built. It plays a pivotal role in industries where the underlying idea is the main asset, though I do think an overly protective mindset can sometimes stifle collaboration that would benefit everyone. Q5: How specifically designed does a product need to be for a particular audience versus being general purpose? I think it depends on the market. Something specifically designed for one narrow group can feel perfect to that group but irrelevant to everyone else. A more general, holistic approach trades some of that precision for wider appeal. Neither is universally better. It comes down to whether you're trying to delight a small audience deeply or serve a much larger one adequately. Episode 7: Standards, Quality, and Performance. Q1: How do you make sure your work meets a genuinely high standard, not just an acceptable one? I usually build in a step where I ask, honestly, whether I'd be comfortable if this were reviewed by someone I respect. That small accurate measurement of quality, comparing against a real standard rather than just good enough, pushes me to catch things I'd otherwise let slide. Q2: What does careful analysis actually look like in practice? For me, careful analysis means resisting the urge to jump to conclusions before I've actually looked at enough evidence. I try to lay out what I know, what I'm assuming, and what's still unclear, rather than blending all three together in my head, which is where most bad decisions quietly start. Q3. How do you present clear evidence to someone who disagrees with your conclusion? I try to lead with the most clear evidence. I have the one fact that's hardest to argue with, rather than overwhelming them with everything at once. If there's a significant difference between what I believe and what they believe, I find it's more productive to ask what evidence would actually change their mind, rather than just repeating my own points louder. Q4. Do you find that different projects have similar characteristics, or does every project feel completely new? Honestly, most projects share similar characteristics once you've done enough of them. The same kinds of risks, the same kinds of miscommunications. Results can still vary significantly in outcome, but the underlying patterns are surprisingly consistent, which is part of why experience genuinely helps, even in fields that feel fast-moving. Q5. What happens when a team assumes results will remain unchanged, but the situation shifts? That's a mistake I've made myself, assuming things will remain unchanged just because they've been stable so far. When conditions shift and no one's paying attention, problems become immediately obvious far too late to fix cheaply. I've become much more comfortable now with regularly questioning assumptions, even ones that used to feel safe. Q6. Do you think a team with great diversity in background performs better on average, or is that overstated? I genuinely think it helps, though I understand the skepticism. A team with great diversity and experience tends to catch blind spots that a more uniform group simply wouldn't notice. Different backgrounds mean different assumptions get questioned. It's a relatively common finding across the projects I've been part of. The teams that struggled most were usually the ones where everyone thought alike from the start. Episode 8. Growth, Environment, and Reflection. Q1. How has your previous experience shaped the way you approach new projects now? My previous experience has made me a lot more cautious about overcommitting early. I've learned the hard way that enthusiasm at the start of a project doesn't always survive contact with reality. I've also gotten better at recognizing the main function of a task before diving in, instead of getting distracted by interesting, but ultimately secondary details. Q2. Can you give a typical example of a decision that was heavily influenced by external pressure rather than pure logic? Sure. A typical example would be rushing a launch date not because the product was actually ready, but because a competitor announced something similar. That decision was clearly heavily influenced by fear rather than strategy, and, honestly, it showed in the quality of what we shipped. Q3. What are the benefits of offering people a great range of options versus a narrow, curated one? A great range of choices can feel empowering, but I've also seen it backfire. Too many options and people freeze up entirely. What actually seems to work is offering a genuinely useful set, curated thoughtfully, rather than every possible option just to seem generous. A high percentage of decision fatigue, honestly, comes from unnecessary choice. Q4. How important is it for a company to genuinely offer an opportunity for growth, rather than just talk about it? Hugely important, and, honestly, easy to fake in words, but hard to fake in practice. When a company claims to offer an opportunity for advancement but never actually follows through, people notice quickly and trust erodes fast. I'd rather work somewhere that underpromises and consistently delivers than the reverse. Q5. Do you think companies take environmental protection seriously enough, or is it mostly about appearances? Honestly, it's mixed. Some companies genuinely commit to environmental protection as part of how they operate, factoring the natural environment into real decisions, not just marketing. Others treat it as decoration, a nice line in a report that doesn't actually shape behavior. I think the difference becomes obvious pretty quickly once you look at what a company actually changes, not just what it says. Episode 9. Projects, Places, and People, Bosung. Q1. What usually determines whether a project counts as a successful implementation? For me, a successful implementation isn't just about finishing on time. It's whether the thing actually gets used the way it was meant to. I've seen projects technically completed on schedule that quietly failed because nobody adopted them afterward. So I try to check in weeks later, not just at launch, to see if it's genuinely working under real, appropriate conditions rather than the ideal ones we tested in. Q2. Does the geographical location of a team affect how a project gets planned? Definitely more than people expect. A team spread across different time zones has to plan very differently from one sitting in the same office. The geographical location of collaborators shapes everything from meeting times to how much gets decided asynchronously in writing rather than live conversation, something I underestimated until I actually managed a distributed team myself. Q3. What's something small, like a form you had to hand in, that turned out to matter more than expected? Oh, easily. Once I had to hand in a routine compliance form I nearly skipped as unimportant, and it turned out to contain a detail that changed how a whole contract was structured. It's a good reminder that some of the most boring paperwork quietly protects everyone involved, even when it feels like a formality. Q4. How seriously should companies take informed consent when collecting data from employees or customers? Very seriously, honestly. Informed consent isn't just a legal checkbox, it's about genuinely respecting people's right to know what's being collected and why. I've worked somewhere that treated it as pure paperwork, and it showed in how casually data was handled elsewhere too. The two tend to go together. Q5. When handling large quantities of data or requests, what's the biggest risk? Mostly, it's losing the human detail in the noise. When you're processing large quantities of anything, it's tempting to treat everything as a statistic rather than an individual case, and that's when mistakes that matter to real people start slipping through. Some situations are also genuinely potentially dangerous if handled carelessly at scale. A small error repeated 1,000 times becomes a much bigger problem than the same error made once. Q6. Is it useful to take in feedback from every source, or should you be selective? I've learned to be selective, actually. Trying to take in every piece of feedback from every direction just leads to paralysis. You end up trying to please everyone and satisfying no one. I now try to weigh feedback by how directly it relates to the actual goal, rather than treating every opinion as equally valuable just because someone bothered to share it. Podcast 5, Everyday Problem Solving and Life Admin, Fan 1. Episode 1, Canceling, Postponing, and Rescheduling. Q1. Do you often have to call off plans at the last minute? More than I'd like, honestly. Life gets messy, and sometimes you just have to call off something you were genuinely looking forward to. I've learned to give people as much notice as possible, because a last-minute cancellation stings a lot more than one you see coming. Q2. What usually makes you put off a task you know you should just do? Mostly discomfort, if I'm honest. Tasks that involve an awkward conversation or a boring form are the ones I'll put off the longest, even when I know delaying just makes them heavier to deal with later. Q3. Have you ever had to break off an agreement or a plan partway through? Yes, once with a shared apartment lease that just wasn't working out. We had to break off the arrangement earlier than planned, which was uncomfortable, but honestly better than dragging out something that clearly wasn't going to improve. Q4. What's your reaction when someone turns down a request you thought was reasonable? I try not to take it personally right away. If someone has to turn down something I've asked for, I assume there's context I'm missing, and I'd rather ask calmly than assume the worst about their reasons. Q5. What do you do if you show up somewhere and realize you got the date completely wrong? Laugh it off, mostly, once the initial embarrassment fades. I once managed to show up to an appointment a full week early. The receptionist was very kind about it, but I still think about it more than I'd like to admit. Q6. How important is it to follow up after a meeting or a request, rather than just waiting? Extremely important, in my experience. If you don't follow up, things quietly slip through the cracks, not out of malice, just because everyone's juggling a dozen other things and yours wasn't the loudest one. Q7. Do you always check over paperwork carefully before signing it? I try to now, though I didn't used to. I once skipped a proper check over on a rental agreement and missed a clause that cost me later, a mistake I've never repeated since. Q8. What's involved when you finally settle up a shared expense with a friend? Usually just a quick transfer and a bit of mental math, honestly. I like to settle up sooner rather than later because small unpaid amounts have a way of quietly building resentment if they linger too long. Q9. Is it satisfying to pay back a debt, even a small one, ahead of schedule? Genuinely, yes. There's a small but real relief in it. I try to pay back anything I owe as soon as I reasonably can, mostly because carrying even a minor debt sits at the back of my mind more than it should. Q10. Do you think it's worth the effort when something risky ends up paying off? Absolutely, though it's easy to forget the anxiety once it does pay off. I try to remind myself, even during the uncertain stretch, that the outcome isn't guaranteed either way, so the effort itself has to be worth something on its own. Episode 2. Sorting, Organizing, and Paperwork. Q1. How do you sort out a pile of admin tasks that's been building up? I usually make a quick list and just start with whatever's smallest, honestly, not whatever feels most urgent. Once I begin to sort out even one or two things, the whole pile feels less overwhelming than it did 5 minutes earlier. Q2. Is it satisfying to tidy up a space that's been cluttered for a while? Genuinely, yes, more than I expect every time. Deciding to tidy up always feels like a chore right up until it's actually done, and then it's oddly one of the most satisfying feelings of the day. Q3. Do you cross out items on a to-do list, or just delete them digitally? Physically cross them out, always, even when I also track things digitally. There's something satisfying about being able to cross out a line with a pen that a digital checkmark just doesn't replicate for me. Q4. Why do you note down small tasks instead of trusting yourself to remember them? Because I've learned the hard way not to trust my memory under pressure. If I don't note down something the moment I think of it, there's a real chance it disappears completely by the time I actually have space to do it. Q5. How often do you print out documents instead of keeping everything digital? Rarely now, but for anything official, contracts, IDs, I still print out a physical copy, just in case. Digital files feel safer until the one time a system glitches at the worst possible moment. Q6. Have you ever had to write up a report you'd been putting off for weeks? Yes, more than once, and it's never as bad as the dread beforehand suggests. Once I finally sit down to write up something I've avoided, it usually takes a fraction of the time I'd build it up to be in my head. Q7. How do you narrow down options when a form gives you too many choices? I eliminate the obviously wrong ones first, then compare what's left properly. Trying to narrow down 10 options at once is overwhelming, but doing it in 2 quick passes makes the decision feel much more manageable. Q8. Have you ever mixed up 2 important dates or documents by accident? Embarrassingly, yes, I once managed to mix up 2 appointments scheduled for the same week and only caught it the night before. Since then I've become almost obsessive about double-checking dates against each other. Q9. Can you usually make out messy handwriting on an old form or note? Sometimes, with effort, though occasionally I genuinely can't make out what a previous version of myself was trying to write, which is a strange and slightly humbling experience. Q10. What's the first thing you cut out when you're trying to simplify a process? Any step that exists purely out of habit rather than necessity. I try to cut out the extra approvals or check-ins that don't actually change the outcome, just to make the whole process breathe a little easier. Episode 3. Starting, Moving, and Letting Go. Q1. What does it take to start up a new routine that actually sticks? Honestly, keeping it small enough that skipping it feels obviously wrong. Whenever I try to start up something ambitious right away, it tends to collapse within 2 weeks. Smaller versions last much longer. Q2. How do you know when it's time to move on from something that isn't working? When I notice I'm defending it more than actually enjoying it. That shift is usually my signal to move on, even if walking away still feels a little uncomfortable in the moment. Q3. Is it easy for you to give away things you no longer use? Getting easier with practice, honestly. I used to hold on to things just in case, but now I try to give away anything I haven't touched in a year. Someone else usually gets more use out of it than I ever will. Q4. What's something small you always take away from a difficult experience? Usually a very specific, practical lesson rather than a vague feeling. I try to take away one clear thing I'd do differently next time, rather than just letting the discomfort pass without learning anything from it. Q5. Do you save up for things deliberately or just spend as you go? Deliberately, mostly, at least for anything significant. I try to save up with a specific goal in mind because vague saving without a target is much easier to abandon the first time something tempting comes along. Q6. What helps you free up time when your schedule feels completely packed? Cutting one recurring commitment that isn't actually serving me anymore, usually. It's uncomfortable to admit something isn't worth the time, but doing that is often the only real way to free up space for what matters more. Q7. How do you open up to people about something you're genuinely struggling with? Slowly, and usually with someone I already trust a fair amount. It takes real effort for me to open up about something difficult, but it almost always feels lighter afterward than I expect beforehand. Q8. Has a plan ever gone off in a completely unexpected direction? Constantly, honestly, plans rarely survive contact with reality exactly as designed. When something goes off script, I try to treat it as information rather than failure. It usually means an assumption was wrong somewhere. Q9. Do you prefer when a difficult conversation goes on longer or gets resolved quickly? Quickly, if it can be resolved honestly. Dragging something out rarely improves it. But I'd rather let it go on a little longer than rush to a fake resolution just to avoid discomfort. Q10. Is there ever anything left over after a project that you have to deal with separately? Almost always, honestly, some loose thread. There's usually something leave over from the main effort that needs its own small follow-up, even after the big, visible part is technically finished. Episode 4. Facing problems and working through things. Q1. What kind of obstacle have you recently come up against that surprised you? A permit requirement I genuinely didn't know existed, actually. I came up against it halfway through a simple project, and it turned a quick task into a 2-week delay. I hadn't budgeted for it all. Q2. Do unexpected expenses tend to crop up more than you'd like? Constantly, honestly, it feels like there's always one. Something always seems to crop up right after I think I've finally accounted for everything, which has taught me to always keep a small buffer just in case. Q3. When a difficult topic comes up in conversation, do you address it directly or let it pass? Directly, usually, though it took practice to get comfortable with that. If something real comes up, avoiding it just means having the same uncomfortable conversation later, except with more build-up tension attached to it. Q4. What does it come down to when you're deciding between two similarly good options? Usually just one practical detail, honestly, once you strip away the noise. It often comes down to which option is easier to reverse if it turns out to be the wrong choice. Q5. How thoroughly do you look into something before committing to it? Fairly thoroughly for anything expensive or hard to undo. I try to look into the details that are easy to overlook, cancellation terms, hidden costs, rather than just trusting the pitch at face value. Q6. Do you look over a contract more than once before signing it? Always. Now, once just isn't enough for anything binding. I make a habit of doing a second look over after a break, because fresh eyes catch things tired eyes skim right past. Q7. What do you do when you need to go over something with someone who's confused? I slow right down and use a concrete example instead of abstract explanation. Taking the time to properly go over something, rather than rushing through it, almost always saves more time than it costs later. Q8. How do you go through a big backlog of messages after being away? I triage ruthlessly, honestly, urgent first, everything else after. Trying to go through every single message in order, without prioritizing, is a guaranteed way to spend the whole afternoon on things that didn't actually matter much. Q9. Do plans ever drop off your radar completely by accident? Occasionally, yes, especially during busy stretches. Something can quietly drop off my attention for a week before I even notice it's missing, which is exactly why I've started keeping a single running list for everything. Q10. Is there a task you keep meaning to thaw out, so to speak, something frozen that needs restarting? Actually, yes, an old project I shelved months ago that I keep meaning to properly thaw out and pick back up, once I finally have a stretch of time that isn't already spoken for. Episode 5. Perspective, Priorities, and Trust. Q1. How far ahead do you usually look ahead when planning something significant? A few months, typically far enough to catch obvious problems, not so far that the plan is pure guesswork. I try to look ahead just enough to prepare without pretending I can predict everything perfectly. Q2. Is it ever tempting to look down on a task because it seems beneath your skill level? Occasionally, honestly, and I try to catch myself when it happens. Choosing to look down on something simple usually backfires. The small tasks are often exactly where mistakes quietly slip through unnoticed. Q3. What do you always look out for before agreeing to something new? Hidden commitments, mostly the fine print people gloss over. I've learned to look out for anything vague in an agreement, because vagueness is usually where problems eventually surface. Q4. How do you focus on the most important task when everything feels urgent? I ask what would actually matter a month from now, not just today. That question helps me focus on the one or two things worth real attention, instead of reacting to whatever feels loudest in the moment. Q5. Do you deliberately focus attention on the hardest part of a task first? Usually, yes. Tackling it early means the rest feels easier by comparison. I try to focus attention on whatever I'm most tempted to avoid, since that's usually the part quietly causing the most stress. Q6. How do you decide where to place emphasis on when explaining something complicated? I lead with whatever's most likely to be misunderstood. I try to place emphasis on the part that trips people up most often, rather than spending equal time on every single detail regardless of importance. Q7. Is it risky to rely heavily on one single source of information? Definitely, in my experience. I try never to rely heavily on just one opinion or dataset, because even a well-intentioned single source can quietly carry a blind spot you won't notice until it's too late. Q8. Can a short conversation genuinely provide insight into a much bigger problem? Surprisingly often, yes. A single honest comment can provide insight into something a whole report missed completely, which is part of why I still value direct conversation over polished summaries. Q9. How much do you take into consideration other people's schedules before proposing a plan? Quite a lot, honestly, more than I used to. I try to take into consideration what else people are juggling before assuming my priority should automatically become theirs too. Q10. Are you comfortable when someone puts forward an idea that challenges your own? Genuinely, yes, more than I expected to be. When someone confidently puts forward a different view, it's usually a sign they've thought about it seriously, and that's worth hearing out properly. Episode 6. Compensating, Managing, and Wrapping Up. Q1. What is a good team usually made up of, in your experience? Honestly, more variety than people expect, not just similar skill sets stacked together. A strong team tends to be made up of people who each notice different kinds of problems, not everyone spotting the same thing. Q2. How do you make up for lost time after an unexpected delay? I don't try to cram everything back in at once, honestly, that usually backfires. I try to make up for it gradually, protecting quality over the following days rather than rushing to look caught up immediately. Q3. Have you ever had to make up an excuse under pressure, and did it work? Rarely, and honestly, badly when I have. I've mostly stopped trying to make up anything on the spot. The truth, even an awkward one, tends to land better than an improvised explanation. Q4. Do you put on a calm face even when you're stressed at work? Sometimes, though I try not to overdo it. There's a difference between staying composed and completely pretending. I'll put on a steady tone, but I try not to hide real problems behind it for too long. Q5. How do you take off pressure when you're overwhelmed by too many small tasks? I pick the single most stressful one and finish it first, honestly. Managing to take off even one nagging task from the list makes the rest feel noticeably lighter, even if nothing else has actually changed. Q6. What do you always take out of a mistake once the initial frustration fades? A concrete lesson, ideally, rather than just guilt. I try to take out something useful from every mistake, otherwise the discomfort of it was completely wasted. Q7. How do you keep on going through a project that's dragging longer than expected? Mostly by shrinking the goalposts temporarily, focusing only on the next small step. Choosing to keep on with something exhausting is much easier when you're not staring at the whole remaining distance at once. Q8. Is it hard to keep up when everyone around you seems to be moving faster? Occasionally, yes, and I've learned not to compare paces too literally. I try to keep up with what genuinely matters for my own goals, rather than matching someone else's pace just because it's visible. Q9. Do you enjoy the small ritual of handing out tasks at the start of a project? More than I expected to, honestly. There's something satisfying about clearly deciding to hand out responsibilities early, because it prevents the confusion of everyone assuming someone else has already picked something up. Q10. Have you had to cut down on anything recently just to protect your own energy? Yes, evening commitments mostly. I've had to cut down on saying yes to everything, simply because spreading myself that thin was quietly costing me more than any single commitment was worth. Podcast 7, Data, Research, and Academic Analysis. Episode 1, Data Basics and Types. Q1, what kinds of data do you usually work with day to day? Mostly a mix, honestly. Sometimes I'm looking at available data that's already been collected by someone else, and other times I'm pulling raw data straight from a source before it's been cleaned up at all. The raw version is always messier than people expect, full of gaps and inconsistencies you have to sort through first. Q2. How do you decide whether historical data is still useful for a current problem? It depends on how much the underlying situation has changed. Historical data can be incredibly useful for spotting long-term patterns, but I've also seen people lean on it too heavily when conditions have shifted so much that the old numbers barely apply anymore. I try to treat it as context, not a direct prediction. Q3. What do you do when you find missing data in the middle of an analysis? Honestly, it happens more often than I'd like. When I hit missing data, my first instinct used to be to just estimate and move on, but now I flag it explicitly instead because pretending a gap doesn't exist can quietly distort the whole conclusion later. Q4. How do you make sure the numerical data you're using is actually reliable? I usually cross-check against a second source if one exists. Numerical data looks authoritative just because it's a number, but numbers can be wrong just as easily as words. I try to hold on to a healthy skepticism, especially with figures that conveniently support whatever I already believed going in. Q5. What separates preliminary data from something you'd actually trust for a final decision? Preliminary data is really just an early signal, useful for deciding whether something's worth investigating further, but risky to act on directly. I've learned not to get too attached to early numbers, since they often shift once a proper sample size builds up. Q6. What makes survey data particularly tricky to interpret? Survey data depends entirely on how honestly people answer, and people aren't always honest, even with themselves. I've seen results skew heavily just because of how a question was phrased. It's why I always want to see the actual questions before trusting the summary someone hands me. On top of that, I always want to be looking at genuinely relevant data and reliable data before drawing anything from it. Episode 2, Research Process and Methodology. Q1. Have you ever had to conduct a survey yourself? What was that like? Yes, once, for a small internal project. Getting people to actually conduct a survey properly, clear questions, no leading language, turned out to be much harder than I expected. Half the effort went into wording the questions so they wouldn't quietly bias the answers. Q2. How important is choosing the right research methodology before you start? Enormously important, and something I underestimated early on. Picking the wrong research methodology at the start can waste months, because the kind of data you need shapes everything else: how you collect it, how you analyze it, even what conclusions are possible at the end. Q3. How do you decide on a research topic when several options seem interesting? I usually pick the research topic that has the least existing clarity, the questions nobody's fully answered yet. It's tempting to chase something exciting, but if there's no real gap, you end up repeating previous research rather than adding something new. Q4. Is recent research always more trustworthy than older studies? Not automatically, no. Recent research benefits from newer tools and data, which is genuinely valuable, but that doesn't make it immune to bias or small sample sizes. I try to weigh the quality of the study itself, not just how recent the publication date is. Q5. What's the difference between qualitative research and quantitative analysis in practice? Qualitative research captures nuance, why people feel or behave a certain way, while quantitative analysis is about measuring how much or how often. I think the best studies usually combine both, because numbers alone miss the story, and stories alone can't be generalized reliably. Q6. How do you know if scientific research and its statistical significance actually mean something important? This trips people up a lot. Scientific research can report statistical significance on a result that's technically real but practically meaningless, a tiny effect detected in a huge sample. I always ask not just, is this significant, but does this actually matter in the real world? Episode 3. Analyzing and Interpreting. Q1. What's your process when you need to interpret data that looks contradictory at first? I slow down instead of forcing an explanation immediately. When I interpret data that seems to contradict itself, it's usually because I'm missing a variable, not because the data is actually wrong. Taking the contradiction seriously, rather than explaining it away too fast, has saved me from bad conclusions more than once. Q2. How do you process data efficiently without cutting corners? I try to automate the repetitive parts so I can spend more attention on the parts that actually require judgment. When you process data by hand for something large, small errors creep in just from fatigue, automation, even something simple, cuts that risk significantly. Q3. What's the best way to present data to people who aren't specialists? Simplify without distorting, basically. When I present data to a general audience, I try to keep the core message intact even as I drop technical detail. It's easy to accidentally mislead people by oversimplifying, so I'm careful about which details are safe to cut. Q4. How do you record data in a way that your future self will actually understand? I learned this one the hard way. Early on, I didn't record data with enough context, just numbers, no notes on what they meant or how they were collected, and 6 months later I had no idea how to interpret my own file. Q5. When you report findings, how honest should you be about the study's weaknesses? Completely honest, in my view. When you report findings, burying the limitations just sets up whoever reads it next to misuse the results. I'd rather flag every weak point up front than have someone build a bad decision on shaky ground because I left something out. Q6. How do you identify a genuine causal relationship instead of just a coincidence? That's genuinely one of the hardest parts of analysis. A real causal relationship requires ruling out other explanations, not just observing that two things move together. I try to isolate the independent variable carefully and stay suspicious of any conclusion that arrived too easily, along with any random variable that might be quietly influencing the outcome, or even a subtle chemical reaction in a physical experiment that no one accounted for. Episode 4. Science, Curiosity, and Understanding. Q1. Is there a scientific topic involving genetic variation that you find especially interesting? Yes, actually, how much genetic variation exists even within what looks like a uniform population fascinates me. It's a reminder that averages hide a huge amount of individual difference, something that matters far beyond biology too. Q2. How do experimental results usually differ from what researchers initially expect? More often than you'd think, honestly. Experimental results frequently surprise the very people running the study, which is part of what makes research worthwhile. If you already knew the answer, you wouldn't need the experiment. Q3. What does it mean for a study to be carefully controlled, and why does that matter? A carefully controlled study isolates the one thing you're actually testing, ruling out other explanations as much as possible. Without that discipline, you might notice a common feature across your results and mistakenly assume it caused the outcome, when it was really just coincidence. Q4. How do you build a comprehensive overview of a topic you're unfamiliar with? I start broad before narrowing. Building a genuinely comprehensive overview means reading enough different sources that you start noticing where they actually disagree, not just repeating whatever the first article told you. Q5. Is it possible to fully understand a complex topic quickly, or does it always take time? Honestly, I think real depth takes time, no matter how smart the shortcut feels. You can grasp the basics fast, but to fully understand something, you usually have to sit with the confusion for a while before it clicks. Q6. What keeps you motivated to explore further once you've already found a satisfying answer? Curiosity, mostly the sense that the first answer is rarely the whole picture. I try to explore further even when I've technically got what I need, because that's usually where the most interesting, fairly straightforward seeming assumptions turn out to hide an underlying reason nobody noticed, one that might directly affect the whole conclusion. Episode 5: Information and Access. Q1. How do you decide what counts as additional information versus unnecessary detail? I ask whether it changes the decision at hand. If a piece of additional information wouldn't actually shift what someone does next, I usually leave it out. Even if it's technically interesting, clarity matters more than completeness. Q2. How much background knowledge do you think people need before joining a discussion on a technical topic? Enough to follow the logic, not necessarily enough to have built it themselves. I try not to assume too much background knowledge when I explain something, because it's easy to forget how much context I've built up that others simply haven't had yet. Q3. Should information always have easy access, or are there good reasons to limit it? It depends on sensitivity. Most information benefits from easy access. It speeds up decisions and builds trust. But some things genuinely need limited access, especially anything involving personal data, where openness could actually cause harm rather than help. Q4. What do you do when you don't have access to information you clearly need? I try to be direct about asking rather than guessing. If I don't have access to something essential, working around it usually wastes more time than simply requesting it properly, even if that feels slower in the moment. Q5. How do you store information so it stays useful months or years later? Consistency matters more than cleverness here. I try to store information using the same simple structure every time, because a clever one-off system I invent today is something future me will have completely forgotten how to use. Q6. Is it better to share information early and often, or wait until you're fully sure? I lean towards sharing early, with caveats attached. Waiting to share information until it's perfectly certain often means sharing it too late to be useful, and if I need to seek information further before finalizing, I'd rather say that out loud than let people assume more confidence than I actually have. Episode 6: Engagement and Contribution. Q1. What made you first become involved in research or analytical work? Honestly, it was almost accidental. I needed data for a small project and ended up genuinely curious about the process. Once you become involved in asking good questions, it's hard to go back to just accepting numbers at face value. Q2. How do you get people who aren't naturally analytical to get involved in a data-driven project? I try to connect the data to something they already care about. People get involved in analysis much faster when they can see it answering a question that actually affects their own work, not just an abstract exercise. Q3. What kind of activity helps someone build real analytical skills, in your opinion? Practice with messy, real data beats textbook examples every time. When you genuinely engage in an activity involving actual uncertainty, contradictions, gaps, ambiguity, you learn far more than from a clean, tidy dataset built for a lesson. Q4. How do you create opportunities for less experienced colleagues to learn analysis on the job? I try to hand over small, low-risk pieces of a bigger project rather than keeping all the interesting work to myself. It's a simple way to create opportunities without putting anyone in over their head too early. Q5. What's a contribution you're proud of making to a project that wasn't originally yours? There was a project where I noticed an assumption nobody had questioned, and pointing it out ended up reshaping the whole approach. Being able to make a contribution like that, even from the sidelines, felt more satisfying than leading a project outright. Q6. Do you think giving feedback publicly helps or hurts a team's willingness to engage honestly? It depends heavily on tone. When people give feedback constructively, it builds trust and raises public awareness of shared standards. Done carelessly, though, public feedback can just make people defensive and quieter next time, which defeats the whole purpose. Episode 6: Performance and Impact. Q1. What's the clearest sign that a change actually led to improved performance? Consistency over time, mostly. A single good result could be luck, but improved performance that holds steady across several cycles is much harder to explain away as coincidence. Q2. Can a small, simple change ever have a great impact on a project's outcome? Surprisingly often, yes. I've seen one small fix have a great impact far beyond what its size suggested. Sometimes the tiniest bottleneck is quietly limiting everything downstream of it. Q3. How do you know when a finding actually carries great significance, rather than just sounding impressive? I ask whether it would change a real decision. A result can sound dramatic, but carry no great significance in practice if nothing would actually be done differently because of it. Q4. What's an example of a decision that had a profound impact on how your team works now? Switching to shorter, more frequent check-ins instead of one long weekly meeting had a genuinely profound impact. Smaller problems got caught before they compounded, and people stopped saving up frustration for a single tense conversation. Q5. How do you know a tool is genuinely a powerful tool and not just popular? I look at what it lets people do that they couldn't do easily before. A truly powerful tool creates a significant effect on how a team works, not just a marginal convenience dressed up as innovation. Q6. What's usually the main source of delay in a research project in your experience? Almost always waiting on other people's input, honestly, not the analysis itself. Identifying the main source of delay early and figuring out which major component of the timeline actually depends on someone else saves a huge amount of frustration later. It also tends to reveal which key area genuinely needs more attention than it's getting. Episode 8. Scale and Degree. Q1. How do you talk about a high concentration of something without sounding overly technical? I try to translate it into something relatable. Instead of saying high concentration, I'll describe what that actually looks or feels like in practice, since raw technical framing tends to lose a general audience fast. Q2. When does a high proportion of something become worth worrying about? It depends entirely on context. A high proportion of errors in a low-stakes task might be fine, while the same proportion somewhere critical is alarming. Even a seemingly small but high percentage shift can matter a lot once you multiply it across a large enough group, so I try not to react to the number alone without asking what it actually represents. Q3. How do you handle a huge amount of information without feeling overwhelmed? I break it into stages rather than trying to absorb a huge amount of material all at once. Even a substantial amount of reading feels manageable once it's split across several sittings instead of one long, exhausting session. Q4. Is a vast range of options always better when you're choosing a tool or method? Not necessarily. A vast range of choices can slow you down more than help. I usually narrow things to 2 or 3 strong candidates early, rather than seriously comparing every possible option available. Q5. What do you do when a task starts becoming increasingly difficult the deeper you go? I check whether the difficulty is genuinely necessary or just a sign I've missed something simpler. Something relatively high in perceived difficulty sometimes has an easier path hiding underneath it, especially if it only became increasingly difficult after one small wrong assumption early on. Q6. How do you make sure the initial stage of a project sets things up properly for a given period ahead? I try to overinvest early, even when it feels slow. Getting the initial stage right, over a clearly defined given period, saves far more time later than rushing to look productive on day one, even when a result looks only slightly different from what you expected at first. Episode 9. Presentation and Communication of Findings. Q1. What makes an oral presentation of research actually land with an audience? Honestly, restraint. A good oral presentation resists the urge to include everything. It picks the few points that matter most and lets the rest live in a written appendix instead. Q2. How do you keep the primary focus clear when a presentation covers a lot of ground? I anchor everything back to one central question and treat every other point as supporting evidence. If the primary focus ever gets fuzzy, the whole talk starts to feel like a list rather than an argument. Q3. Should you avoid technical terms entirely when speaking to a general audience? Not entirely, but I try to define any technical term the moment I use it, rather than assuming familiarity. Skipping that step is the fastest way to lose half the room in the first 2 minutes. Q4. How do you know if a piece of work actually meets criteria, rather than just seeming close enough? I go back to the original requirement and check it literally, not from memory. It's easy to convince yourself something meets criteria when you're proud of the effort behind it, even if it technically falls short. Q5. How do normal conditions differ from the edge cases people usually forget to plan for? Most plans work fine under normal conditions. It's the exceptions that expose weak design. I've started deliberately asking what happens when this goes wrong earlier instead of treating edge cases as an afterthought. Q6. What relevant factors do you consider before deciding a project is genuinely worth the stress it might cause? I weigh the expected outcome against what it'll cost the team, including how much it might reduce stress later versus how much it demands right now. If the final result doesn't feel extremely useful relative to that cost, it's usually a sign to scale the project down rather than push through. Episode 10. Final checks and outcomes. Q1. How does experimental data differ from data you just observe naturally? Experimental data comes from a situation you've deliberately controlled, so you can isolate one variable at a time. Observational data just captures whatever happens without that control, which makes cause and effect much harder to prove. Q2. Do you always carry out a formal risk assessment before starting something new? For anything with real stakes, yes. A proper risk assessment forces you to name the worst-case scenario out loud instead of just hoping it won't happen, and that alone changes how carefully people plan. Q3. When is statistical analysis actually necessary versus just eyeballing the numbers? Once a pattern isn't obvious at a glance, or the stakes are high enough that being wrong is costly, I bring in real statistical analysis rather than trusting intuition alone. Q4. How clearly do you define the desired outcome before starting a project? As specifically as possible early on. Without a clear desired outcome, it's surprisingly easy for a team to work hard for weeks and still disagree afterward about whether they actually succeeded. Q5. Are all steps in a research process equally important, or do some matter more? Honestly, no. Some steps are far more equally important in theory than they turn out to be in practice. A few decisions early on quietly determine everything that follows, while plenty of later steps are simply mechanical execution. Q6. What makes a method highly effective rather than just adequate? A highly effective method doesn't just work, it keeps working reliably as conditions change slightly, which is the part people usually forget to test for. Q7. How do you decide what counts as necessary information versus a nice-to-have? I ask what breaks if it's missing. If leaving something out doesn't actually block a decision, it's not truly necessary information, it's just comfortable to have. Q8. Does experience play a role in how quickly someone learns to trust or distrust their own analysis? Definitely, experience seems to play a role in exactly that. Early on, I trusted every clean-looking number. Now I've learned which kinds of results deserve a second, more skeptical look. Q9. When someone asks a follow-up question, how much detail should you provide details on the spot? Enough to answer honestly, but not so much that it derails the whole conversation. I try to provide details only as deep as the question actually calls for, and offer to go further afterward if someone wants it. Podcast 7. Arguments, Opinions, and Critical Thinking. Episode 1. Issues and Topics. Q1. What do you do when a controversial issue comes up in a group conversation? I try to slow the conversation down rather than let it turn into people just repeating positions louder. A genuinely controversial issue rarely has one obvious right answer, so I'd rather understand why people disagree than win the exchange outright. Q2. How do you find the core issue when a problem seems to have many layers? I keep asking why until the answers stop changing. Usually the core issue is hiding 2 or 3 layers beneath the first complaint someone makes, and if you only fix the surface, the same problem tends to resurface later in a different form. Q3. Do you think every ethical issue has a clear right answer, or is it usually more complicated? Almost always more complicated, honestly. An ethical issue often involves 2 reasonable values pulling in opposite directions, not a clean choice between right and wrong. I've learned to be suspicious of anyone who makes it sound too simple. Q4. How aware are you of global issues that don't directly affect your daily life? Fairly aware, though I'll admit my attention shifts depending on what's in the news. I try to stay informed about a global issue even when it feels distant, because ignoring something just because it's not local usually catches up eventually. Q5. What's a practical issue you've had to deal with recently that seemed small but wasn't? A scheduling conflict. Actually, it seemed like a minor practical issue at first, but it ended up revealing a much bigger gap in how our team coordinated across time zones. Q6. When someone raises a technical issue mid-conversation, how do you keep the discussion accessible to everyone? I ask them to pause and explain it in plain terms before going further. A technical issue raised without context tends to lose half the room instantly, even if the point itself is genuinely important. Q7. Is it always worth trying to discuss a topic that people clearly disagree strongly on? Usually yes, carefully. I'd rather discuss a topic openly, even an uncomfortable one, than let unspoken tension sit under the surface. Avoiding it doesn't make the disagreement disappear, it just delays it. Q8. What's your approach when you have to deal with an issue that involves conflicting priorities? I try to name the trade-off explicitly rather than pretend both sides can fully win. When you deal with an issue like that honestly, at least everyone understands what's actually being sacrificed, even if they don't love the decision. Q9. Is it appropriate to raise an issue publicly, or should it always go through private channels first? It depends on how urgent and how personal it is. For most things, I'd raise an issue privately first, out of respect, and only bring it into a wider conversation if that private approach genuinely doesn't work. Q10. How do you connect a related topic into a conversation without derailing it? Carefully, and only if it actually adds something. Bringing up a related topic can enrich a discussion, but I try to check whether it's genuinely relevant or just something I personally find interesting. Episode 2. Arguments and Evidence. Q1. What makes someone able to make an argument convincingly without sounding aggressive? Calm confidence, mostly stating the point clearly once rather than repeating it louder. People who make an argument well tend to leave room for the other person to respond, rather than trying to win by volume. Q2. How much evidence is enough to support an argument confidently? Enough that a reasonable skeptic would have to take it seriously, honestly, not necessarily overwhelming proof. To genuinely support an argument, I try to find the strongest single piece of evidence rather than piling up 10 weak ones. Q3. What does having ample evidence for a claim actually look like in practice? It usually means the claim would survive someone actively trying to disprove it. Ample evidence isn't just a big pile of data, it's data that holds up even when you specifically look for the weak points. Q4. How important is it to provide evidence immediately versus building up to it? I usually lead with it, actually. If you wait too long to provide evidence, people form an opinion based on your tone alone, and by the time the facts arrive, they've already half made up their mind. Q5. What counts as sufficient evidence before you're comfortable changing your own opinion on something? Honestly, less than people assume. I try to stay genuinely open. Once there's sufficient evidence pointing a different direction, I'd rather update my view than defend a position just because I held it first. Q6. How do you explain a basic concept to someone without oversimplifying it into something misleading? I try to keep the core logic intact even while cutting detail. A basic concept explained badly can create a wrong mental model that's actually harder to unlearn later than just staying confused. Q7. Why does a precise definition matter so much in a disagreement? Because half of all arguments, honestly, come from two people using the same word to mean different things. Getting a precise definition on the table early often dissolves a disagreement that looked much bigger than it actually was. Q8. When is a theoretical framework more useful than just looking at raw examples? When you need to generalize beyond a single case. A theoretical framework helps you see why something works, not just that it worked once, which matters if you want the insight to apply somewhere new. Q9. How do you build a detailed analysis without losing the reader in unnecessary complexity? I structure it in layers, a short summary first, then a detailed analysis underneath for anyone who wants to go deeper. That way people aren't forced through the depth if they only need the headline. Q10. Is a graphical representation always clearer than a written explanation? Not always, but often, especially for numbers. A good graphical representation can reveal a pattern instantly that would take several paragraphs to describe, though a bad one can also mislead just as fast. Episode 3. Thinking Styles. Q1. What does creative thinking actually look like when you're stuck on a problem? For me, It usually means deliberately asking a strange question. What would the opposite approach look like? Creative thinking rarely arrives from staring harder at the same angle. It comes from shifting the angle entirely. Q2. How do you practice critical thinking in everyday situations, not just at work? Mostly by pausing before accepting the first explanation that sounds plausible. Critical thinking isn't about being suspicious of everything. It's about noticing when something's being accepted just because it's convenient, not because it's actually been checked. Q3. Is it useful to think differently on purpose, even when your current approach seems to be working? Yes, occasionally, even success can hide a fragile assumption. I try to think differently on purpose every so often, just to test whether the current approach is actually the best one, or just the one that's familiar. Q4. How long do you usually think over a decision before committing to it? It depends on how reversible it is. For something small, I decide fast. For something bigger, I'll deliberately think over it overnight, because a decision that still feels right the next morning is usually more trustworthy than one made in the moment. Q5. What does your thought process look like when you're trying to solve something genuinely new? Messier than I'd like. Honestly, lots of half-formed ideas before anything clicks. My thought process usually starts wide, narrows painfully slowly, and only makes sense in hindsight once I can look back at how I got there. Q6. How do you weigh up two options that both have real advantages? I try to name what I'd be giving up in each direction, not just what I'd be gaining. When you genuinely weigh up the trade-offs instead of just listing pros, the better option usually becomes clearer. Q7. What's the first step in learning to identify a problem before it becomes serious? Paying attention to small, recurring frustrations instead of dismissing them individually. You often identify a problem early simply by noticing the same minor complaint showing up more than once. Q8. When does a challenge genuinely pose a challenge worth taking seriously versus one you can ignore? When ignoring it would cost more later than addressing it now. Something that only mildly poses a challenge today can quietly grow if left unattended, so I try to catch it while it's still small. Q9. How do you decide whether a proposed solution would seem appropriate to people outside your immediate team? I try to imagine explaining it to someone with no context at all. If a solution wouldn't seem appropriate once you strip away the internal jargon and assumptions, that's usually a sign it needs rethinking. Q10. Is it healthy to strongly agree with someone just to avoid conflict, even when you have doubts? No, honestly, and I've learned that the hard way. Pretending to strongly agree when you don't just delays a disagreement that resurfaces later, usually at a worse moment than if you'd voiced it honestly the first time. Episode 4. Roles and Factors. Q1. What's usually the critical factor that determines whether a project succeeds or fails? Communication, more often than skill, honestly. Technical ability matters, but the critical factor I've seen separate successful projects from failed ones is almost always whether people spoke up early enough about problems. Q2. Does experience always play a critical role, or can enthusiasm make up for it? Experience plays a genuinely critical role, but enthusiasm can compensate for a while, especially early on. The danger is when enthusiasm alone carries someone past the point where experience should have kicked in. Q3. What holds a central role in how your team makes decisions? Honestly, trust holds the most central role, more than any formal process. Even a messy decision-making structure works fine if people trust each other. A clean structure fails quickly if they don't. Q4. What plays a vital role in keeping a long project from losing momentum? Visible progress, even small amounts of it. A vital role is played by simply showing people that something is moving forward, because momentum dies quietly the moment progress becomes invisible. Q5. What's the main factor that makes some meetings genuinely useful and others a waste of time? Whether a real decision needs to be made, honestly. The main factor separating a useful meeting from a wasted one is almost always whether it could have just been a written update instead. Q6. What key component of a plan do people most often overlook? The fallback option, usually. People plan the ideal path in detail, but skip the key component of what happens if that path doesn't work, and then panic when it inevitably doesn't go perfectly. Q7. What's an integral part of your process that you wouldn't want to skip, even under time pressure? A final review before sending anything out, honestly. It's become such an integral part of my process that skipping it, even once, has burned me every single time I tried to save the 10 minutes. Q8. What's an essential element of good feedback that people often get wrong? Specificity, mostly. Vague praise or vague criticism misses the essential element that actually helps someone improve. You have to point at something concrete enough that they know exactly what to repeat or change. Q9. Who is usually directly responsible for a mistake in a team setting, in your experience? It's rarely just one person, honestly, even when it feels that way in the moment. Whoever's directly responsible for the final decision usually gets the blame, but the real cause is often a chain of smaller choices upstream. Q10. What's the main task people tend to procrastinate on the longest? The one with no clear starting point, usually. The main task that keeps getting pushed back is almost never the hardest one technically, it's the one that's vaguest, because starting feels harder than the actual work would be. Episode 5. Impact and Consequences. Q1. How do you assess the impact of a decision before you've actually made it? I try to imagine the worst plausible outcome, not just the best one. When you genuinely assess the impact of a choice honestly, including the uncomfortable scenarios, you tend to make better decisions than if you only imagine things going well. Q2. Is it worth taking time to consider the impact of a small change, or is that overkill? For truly small changes, maybe not, but people are often bad at judging which changes are actually small. I try to consider the impact of anything that touches more than just my own work, just in case it ripples further than expected. Q3. Can one decision have an enormous impact even if it seemed minor at the time? Absolutely, and that's exactly what makes decisions dangerous to underestimate. I've seen a choice that felt like a footnote turn out to have an enormous impact months later, once its consequences compounded with other changes. Q4. What's an example of something with a major impact that most people don't notice happening? Small habitual delays, honestly. A major impact builds quietly from tiny recurring friction, a slow approval process, for example, that nobody flags individually but which collectively slows everything down. Q5. How do you recover when a decision has a clear negative impact? Own it quickly and adjust, rather than defending the original choice out of pride. A negative impact, acknowledged early, is usually far easier to fix than one that gets quietly ignored while people hope it resolves itself. Q6. What kind of change tends to have the most significant impact relative to its size? Changes to defaults. Actually, the option people get automatically if they do nothing. A tiny shift there can have a significant impact because most people never bother to change a default even when a better option exists. Q7. Do you always think through what consequences a decision might have consequences for, beyond the obvious? I try to, though I don't always succeed. Decisions have consequences that ripple outward further than the immediate, obvious ones, so I've learned to specifically ask who else might be affected before finalizing anything. Q8. What's a good way to reduce the likelihood of the same mistake happening twice? Writing it down honestly, rather than just remembering to be more careful. A clear note about what went wrong does more to reduce the likelihood of repeating it than good intentions ever have for me. Q9. What's a beneficial effect that came from a change you initially resisted? A stricter review process I fought against at first turned out to have a real beneficial effect. It slowed us down slightly, but it caught mistakes that would have been far more expensive later. Q10. Can pushing back on an idea actually create problems, even if your concerns were valid? Yes, if it's not handled carefully. Raising real concerns can still create problems if it comes across as blocking rather than improving. Timing and tone matter almost as much as the substance of the objection itself. Episode 6. Presentations and Communication. Q1. What's the hardest part of learning to give a presentation confidently? Getting comfortable with silence, honestly, not rushing to fill every pause. The people I admire who give a presentation well seem completely at ease letting a point land quietly before moving to the next one. Q2. How do you give guidance to someone without just doing the task for them? I try to ask questions that point them toward the answer rather than handing it over directly. Real give guidance moments happen when someone works out the solution themselves, with just enough of a nudge from me. Q3. What makes a written summary genuinely useful rather than just shorter? It has to preserve the actual decision-relevant parts, not just compress word count. A good way to provide a summary is to imagine someone will only read that paragraph and act on it. Nothing important can be missing. Q4. When is it appropriate to make a recommendation versus just presenting the options neutrally? If you genuinely have relevant expertise, I think it's fair to make a recommendation clearly, while still explaining your reasoning so people can disagree if they see something you missed. Q5. How do you know when you need further information before making a call? When two people could reasonably read the same situation completely differently, that's usually my signal that I need further information before deciding anything. Q6. How do you separate relevant information from noise in a long discussion? I keep asking whether a point changes the outcome. If it doesn't, it's probably not truly relevant information, however interesting it might be on its own. Q7. What's valuable information you almost dismissed because it came from an unexpected source? A junior colleague once flagged something the rest of us had missed entirely, and it turned out to be genuinely valuable information, a good reminder that seniority doesn't guarantee who notices what. Q8. How do you politely obtain information from someone who seems reluctant to share it? I try to explain clearly why I need it, rather than just asking bluntly. People are usually much more willing to help you obtain information once they understand what it's actually for. Q9. Is it worth trying to increase awareness of a problem before you have a solution ready? Sometimes, carefully, you don't want to create anxiety with nowhere to direct it. But generally, I think it's fair to increase awareness early, as long as you're honest that a fix is still in progress. Q10. What kind of explanation is commonly used, but actually not very effective, in your opinion? Jargon-heavy summaries, honestly. They're commonly used because they sound authoritative, but they often confuse more than they clarify. A plain explanation usually serves the listener far better. Episode 7. Scale, Quality, and Performance. Q1. How do you judge whether a considerable amount of effort actually paid off? I compare the outcome against what would have happened with a more modest effort. Sometimes a considerable amount of work barely moves the needle, and that's an uncomfortable but important thing to notice honestly. Q2. Does the great majority of decisions in your work feel high stakes or mostly routine? Mostly routine. Honestly, the great majority are small, reversible choices. It's easy to treat every decision as important, but that just leads to exhaustion. Saving real energy for the few that truly matter works better. Q3. What's something that would greatly increase your confidence in a decision if you had it? A second, independent opinion, usually. Just one outside perspective can greatly increase how confident I feel, especially when I've been staring at the same problem long enough to lose perspective on it. Q4. Do you think people generally have high expectations of themselves or the opposite? It varies a lot, but I've noticed a pattern where people hold high expectations for others while being surprisingly forgiving of their own shortcuts, worth watching for in yourself, honestly. Q5. What's something that holds high value even though it's easy to overlook? Clear documentation, genuinely. It holds real high value long after the excitement of a project fades, because it's the thing that saves whoever comes next from repeating your same confusion. Q6. What makes a process highly efficient without cutting corners on quality? Removing unnecessary steps rather than rushing the necessary ones. A highly efficient process isn't faster because people work harder. It's faster because there's simply less waste built into it. Q7. How do you judge the overall performance of a project beyond just whether it was finished on time? I look at whether it actually solved the problem it was meant to, not just whether the checklist got completed. Overall performance has to include impact, not only completion. Q8. Are the economic benefits of a decision always the most important factor to weigh? No, though they matter. Economic benefits are easier to measure than things like trust or morale, which tempts people to overweight them simply because they're quantifiable, even when they're not actually the biggest factor. Q9. What's something extremely valuable that took you a long time to appreciate? Honest, uncomfortable feedback, genuinely. It felt unpleasant at the time, but looking back, it was extremely valuable, far more useful than the polite, vague feedback I used to prefer receiving. Q10. When is a relatively low amount of preparation actually enough? For low-stakes, reversible decisions, honestly, a relatively low amount of preparation is completely fine. Over-preparing for something small just wastes time you could spend on something that actually needs it. Episode 8. Time and Change. Q1. How do you stay motivated during an extended period without visible progress? I try to shrink the time frame I'm judging myself against. An extended period without obvious results feels much less discouraging if I focus on this week's small movement instead of the entire stretch at once. Q2. What's the risk of making a big decision in a very short period? You miss information that would have surfaced with a little more patience. A short period can be enough for something simple, but rushing a complex decision usually means discovering problems only after it's too late to easily undo. Q3. How do you know when you've reached the final stage of a project versus just a pause? When what's left is polish, not substance. The final stage is usually recognizable because the core work is genuinely done. Everything remaining is refinement rather than new discovery. Q4. Can a minor change ever have effects far beyond what its size suggests? Yes, more often than people expect. A minor change to a process or a default setting can quietly ripple outward, especially once enough people rely on it without realizing how much they do. Q5. Why do you think some ideas become increasingly popular even when they're not obviously the best option? Momentum, mostly, visibility feeds on itself. Something becomes increasingly popular partly because it's already popular, which isn't always connected to whether it's actually the strongest choice available. Q6. What's something simple, like needing to fill in a form, that ends up more complicated than expected? Honestly, almost any time you have to fill in official paperwork, the instructions assume context you don't have, and what should take 5-minute stretches into an hour of confusion and second-guessing. Q7. How do you put together a plan when several people have very different priorities? I try to find the smallest shared goal everyone actually agrees on first. Once you put together a plan around that common ground, it's much easier to negotiate the remaining disagreements one at a time. Q8. How narrow should a specific area of focus be before it becomes too limiting? Narrow enough to make real progress, but not so narrow you lose sight of why it mattered. I try to define a specific area clearly, then revisit occasionally to check it's still the right one. Q9. How do you keep your primary objective in mind when a project keeps expanding in scope? I write it down somewhere visible and check back against it regularly. It's surprisingly easy to lose sight of the primary objective once a project picks up momentum and starts absorbing every adjacent idea. Podcast 9. Everyday Problem Solving and Life Admin, Fan 2, Tap Koi. Episode 1. Decisions, Actions, and Roles. Q1. What counts as an appropriate action when a plan starts going wrong? Usually the smallest step that actually addresses the real problem, not the most dramatic one. I try to take the appropriate action for the situation as it actually is, rather than reacting to how alarming it feels in the moment. Q2. How do you know when you've reached a genuinely final decision versus one you might still reverse? Honestly, when I stop actively looking for reasons to change my mind. A final decision feels different from a tentative one. There's a kind of settledness to it that arrives once the real thinking is actually done. Q3. What's usually the crucial part of a project that determines everything else? The initial framing, almost always. Getting the crucial part right early, defining what success actually means, shapes every decision that follows far more than any single execution detail later on. Q4. Do you think most people take their essential role in a team seriously enough? Mostly yes, though it varies. People generally understand their essential role, but it's easy to underestimate how much a small, quiet contribution actually holds the rest of the structure together. Q5. What does it mean to genuinely play a key role, rather than just being present? Being the person something would actually fall apart without, honestly. Playing a key role isn't about visibility. Some of the most important contributions are the least noticed until they're suddenly missing. Q6. What's usually the major cause behind recurring problems in a routine? Something small left unaddressed for too long, almost every time. The major cause is rarely one dramatic event. It's usually a minor friction point nobody bothered to fix when it was still easy to fix. Q7. How do you tell a major problem apart from something that just feels urgent in the moment? I ask whether it'll still matter in a month. A genuine major problem tends to survive that question. Something that only feels urgent right now often fades once the initial stress passes. Q8. What do you do the moment you face a problem you weren't expecting? Pause before reacting. Honestly, that single pause changes almost everything. Choosing to face a problem calmly, rather than panicking immediately, tends to produce a far clearer next step. Q9. Can a task present a challenge even if it looked simple on paper? Constantly. Actually, the gap between planning and doing is where most surprises hide. Something can present a challenge that nobody anticipated, simply because reality always has more detail than a plan accounts for. Q10. How do you weigh an increased risk against a potentially bigger reward? Carefully, and usually by asking what happens in the worst case, not just the best one. I'm willing to accept an increased risk only when I could genuinely live with the downside if it actually happened. Q11. What usually becomes the main focus once a project actually gets underway? Something different from what I expected at the start, more often than not. The main focus tends to shift once real constraints show up. Plans are useful, but reality always has the final say. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 2. Knowledge, Learning, and Explanation. Q1. What's a basic principle you rely on that most people overlook? Honestly, just doing the boring, obvious thing consistently. That basic principle, consistency over intensity, has quietly outperformed almost every clever shortcut I've ever tried instead. Q2. How do you give a brief overview of something complicated without oversimplifying it too much? I focus on the shape of the idea, not every detail. A good brief overview should leave someone with an accurate, if incomplete, picture, not a false sense that they now understand the whole thing. Q3. Did your time at an educational institution actually prepare you for real work? Partly, honestly, more for how to think than for the specific tasks themselves. An educational institution taught me structure and discipline, but most of the practical skills I actually use, I picked up afterward. Q4. How much prior knowledge do you usually assume when explaining something to someone new? As little as reasonably possible. Now, I've learned that assuming too much prior knowledge is the fastest way to lose someone early in an explanation, even unintentionally. Q5. What makes a good explanation genuinely helpful rather than just technically correct? Meeting the listener where they actually are, honestly. I try to give an explanation that starts from something they already understand, then builds outward, rather than starting from where I happen to already be. Q6. How comfortable are you when you have to give information you know someone won't want to hear? More comfortable than I used to be, though it's never entirely easy. I try to give information clearly and kindly, without softening it so much that the actual message gets lost in the process. Q7. What's your first move when you need to find information quickly under pressure? Going to the most reliable source first, even if it's slower, rather than the fastest one. I'd rather take an extra minute to find information I can actually trust than move fast on something shaky. Q8. When do you feel you genuinely need someone to provide guidance, rather than just answers? When the problem is more about judgment than facts, honestly. I'd rather someone provide guidance, helping me think it through, than simply tell me what to do without explaining the reasoning. Q9. How important is it for a workplace to provide access to the tools people actually need? Hugely important, and often underestimated. When a company fails to provide access to basic tools, people quietly build workarounds that cost far more time than the tool itself would have. Q10. What's a recent moment where a small comment gave you a genuine new insight? Actually, a casual remark from someone outside my field once completely reframed how I thought about a stuck problem. That kind of new insight rarely comes from within the same small circle you've already been thinking in. Episode 3. Change, Growth and Systems. Q1. Do you feel like the tools you use change rapidly enough to keep up with, or too rapidly? Honestly, sometimes too rapidly. The moment I feel comfortable, something changes rapidly again. I've learned to hold my habits a bit loosely now, since clinging too tightly to one version of a tool rarely pays off for long. Q2. What's something in your life or work that seems to grow rapidly once it gets started? Small habits, oddly, momentum builds faster than people expect. Once something starts to grow rapidly, even a tiny consistent effort compounds into something much bigger than the initial input suggested it would. Q3. How do you keep your energy remain stable through a demanding week? Mostly by protecting sleep and one non-negotiable break, honestly. Keeping my energy remain stable, rather than swinging wildly, matters more to overall output than any single burst of extra effort. Q4. Have you ever had to work with a modified version of a plan that changed halfway through? Yes, often plans rarely survive their first contact with reality unchanged. I've gotten better at accepting a modified version gracefully, rather than treating any deviation from the original as a kind of failure. Q5. How do you feel about relying on one big integrated system versus several smaller separate tools? I lean toward the integrated option now, honestly, despite some resistance to switching. A single integrated system removes a lot of the friction that comes from constantly moving information between disconnected tools. Q6. Is it satisfying to switch on/off a device or a system and have it just work? Genuinely, yes, more than it should be. Something as simple as being able to switch on/off a system reliably feels like a small luxury once you've dealt with tools that don't behave that predictably. Q7. How do you make adjustments to a plan without losing sight of the original goal? I keep the goal written down somewhere visible, honestly, and check every change against it. Make adjustments along the way is normal, but only if they still clearly serve the same underlying purpose. Q8. What do you do when a tool or method have limitations you didn't anticipate? I try to work around the gap rather than force the tool to do something it wasn't built for. Recognizing that something have limitations early saves a lot of frustration compared to discovering it under pressure. Q9. How do you use the early stage of a project to set a good pace for everything after? Deliberately slower than feels natural, honestly. Using the early stage to build solid habits and clear expectations pays off far more than rushing to look productive in the very first week. Episode 4. Comparing, Differences and Similarity. Q1. Have you ever expected two options to be similar and found them entirely different instead? Constantly, actually, assumptions about similarity are usually wrong more often than expected. Two things that look alike on paper can turn out to be entirely different once you actually try using them side by side. Q2. What's the most obvious difference between how you worked a few years ago and how you work now? Patience, honestly. I plan more and rush less than I used to. That obvious difference shows up in almost everything now, from how I write emails to how I approach unexpected problems. Q3. Do two versions of the same task ever end up totally different in practice? Surprisingly often, yes. The same instructions handled by two different people can produce totally different results, which taught me to write much clearer, more specific instructions than I used to bother with. Q4. Have you noticed a positive correlation between preparation and how calm you feel under pressure? Definitely, there's a fairly consistent positive correlation there, in my own experience. The more genuinely prepared I am beforehand, the less anything unexpected manages to actually rattle me in the moment. Q5. Can a small delay significantly affect the outcome of a much bigger project? Yes, more than people expect. A short delay early on can significantly affect everything downstream, especially if other people's timelines were quietly depending on yours without you realizing it. Q6. How strongly influenced by other people's opinions are you when making a personal decision? Less than I used to be, honestly, though I still value input. I try to stay strongly influenced by facts and my own judgment first, and treat outside opinions as useful context rather than the deciding factor. Q7. How do you organize related information so it's easy to find again later? I group by purpose rather than by date, usually. Keeping related information together, even if it was created at different times, makes it far easier to find later than sorting purely chronologically. Q8. How much detailed information do you actually need before making most everyday decisions? Less than I assume going in, honestly. I've noticed I often gather far more detailed information than the decision actually requires, mostly just to feel more confident rather than because it's strictly necessary. Q9. When comparing options, do you consider various aspects equally or focus on just one? I try to weigh several various aspects together rather than fixating on one, since optimizing for a single factor often quietly sacrifices something else that mattered more than I initially realized. Episode 5. Assessment and Quality. Q1. How important is it to you that a process produces consistent results over time? Extremely important, honestly, sometimes more than raw performance itself. I'd rather trust a process with consistent results than one that occasionally performs brilliantly but fails unpredictably the rest of the time. Q2. What does it take to measure something with great accuracy rather than a rough estimate? Patience, mostly, and a willingness to double-check. Getting great accuracy usually means resisting the urge to stop at the first plausible-looking number and verifying it a second time instead. Q3. Is there an idea you currently have that you think has great potential but hasn't gone anywhere yet? Actually, yes, something I've sketched out but haven't had the bandwidth to properly pursue. I think it has genuine great potential, but potential alone clearly isn't enough without dedicated time behind it. Q4. Do you prefer working at a high level of abstraction or getting into fine detail? Both, depending on the stage, honestly. I like starting at a high level to get direction right, then dropping into detail once the broad shape actually makes sense to commit to. Q5. How do you stay motivated in a highly competitive environment without burning out? By focusing on my own progress rather than constant comparison mostly. A highly competitive environment can be energizing in small doses, but treated as a constant benchmark, it wears people down fast. Q6. What's something in your work that's highly sensitive to small mistakes? Client communication, honestly, a small wording slip can shift a whole relationship. Anything highly sensitive like that gets an extra review from me before it goes out, no matter how rushed the day is. Q7. What makes a system or a process feel genuinely well designed to you? When you barely notice it, honestly, good design tends to disappear into the background. A well-designed process just quietly works, without demanding constant attention or workarounds from the people using it. Q8. How do you make sure your explanations are readily understood by people outside your field? I test them on someone unfamiliar with the topic first, honestly, before trusting my own judgment. If it's not readily understood by them, it usually means I've skipped a step I didn't realize I was assuming. Q9. Is a relatively simple solution always better than a more sophisticated one? Usually, yes, all else being equal. A relatively simple solution is easier to maintain and explain, and I've learned to be suspicious of complexity that doesn't clearly earn its keep. Q10. How do you handle a situation generally considered too risky to attempt? I try to separate the reputation of the idea from the actual evidence behind it. Something generally considered risky isn't automatically wrong. Sometimes it's just unfamiliar, which is a very different problem to solve. Episode 6. Individuals, the physical world and examples. Q1. How do you balance individual needs with what's best for the whole team? Carefully, and usually case by case, honestly. I try to respect individual needs wherever I reasonably can, while still being clear when something has to serve the group over any one person's preference. Q2. Are you someone who pays attention to the physical properties of objects, texture, weight, that sort of thing? More than I used to admit, actually. I've noticed the physical properties of a well-made object, how it feels, how it holds up, genuinely change how much I enjoy using it day to day. Q3. How do you identify factors that are actually driving a recurring problem, rather than just symptoms? I try to trace things backward rather than reacting to whatever's most visible. To properly identify factors behind a pattern, you usually have to look 1 or 2 layers beneath the obvious first explanation. Q4. How much do external factors versus your own effort determine how something turns out? Honestly, more than people like to admit, in both directions. External factors shape outcomes constantly, which is exactly why I try not to judge my own effort purely by results I couldn't fully control. Q5. Can you give a specific example of a small habit that made a real difference for you? Sure, writing down one thing I'm grateful for each morning, actually. It sounds small, but as a specific example, it's quietly shifted my mood on genuinely difficult days more than I expected it to. Q6. When does a plan seem unlikely to work, in your honest opinion, even before you've tried it? When it depends on too many things going right at once, honestly. If a plan would seem unlikely to survive even one small setback, I usually build in a fallback before committing to it fully. Q7. How do you know when a significant amount of your time is being spent on something that doesn't matter? I track roughly where my time goes for a week, occasionally, just to check my assumptions. It's uncomfortable to discover a significant amount of effort quietly going somewhere that isn't actually a real priority. Q8. What makes a complex problem feel more manageable once you actually start working on it? Breaking it into smaller, separately solvable pieces, almost always. A complex problem stops feeling overwhelming the moment you stop trying to hold the whole thing in your head all at once.